bearing a leg, and say, "I see you, my lord," then duck back down and snatch up the foreleg again like a fool. You'd not grab at a horse's legs that way unless you wanted kicking. But then Perrin expected nothing but foolishness, really. First there was Lations playing at being Aiel, with his shoulder-long hair tied off in a tail at the nape of his neck, in weak imitation of how Aiel cut theirs. And now the man was playing at being a spy. Perrin rested a hand on the gelding's neck to soothe the animal after all that snatching, and put an interested look on his face as he peered at a hoof that had absolutely nothing wrong with it, except for a nick in the shoe where the iron might break in a few days if it was not replaced. His hands itched for farrier's tools. It seemed years since he had changed a horse's shoes or worked a forge. "Last of all was his word, my lord," Lation said softly, head down. "His friend is traveling to sell his wares, but is expected back tomorrow or the next day. He said to ask whether it will be all right if we catch up to you then." Peering under the horse's belly at the windwards down by the river, he added, "Though it hardly looks as if you will be away before." Perrin scowled down at the windwing. He scowled at the line of carts waiting their turn to be loaded, at the half-dozen or so that already had their canvas covers slashed down. One of those held the first of the leather for patching boots and candles and such. No oil, though. The lamp oil in Sil Harbor smelled as rancid as the cooking oil. What if Gaul and the maidens brought word of Fail? An actual sighting, perhaps. He would give anything to talk to someone who had seen her, to tell him she was unharmed. What if the shadow began to move suddenly? "Tell Bulwer not to wait too long," he growled. "As for me, I'll be away inside the hour." He was as good as his word. Most of the carts and drivers had to be left behind to make the one-day journey back to camp on their own. Urayan and his green-helmeted soldiers to guard them, with orders that no one was to cross the bridges. Cold-eyed, appearing completely recovered from his breakdown, the Gildanon assured him that he was fit and ready. Very likely, orders or not, he would be going back into Sil Harbor just to convince himself he was not afraid. Perrin did not waste time trying to talk him out of it. For one thing, Sioned had to be found. She was not precisely hiding, yet she had learned of his departure, and, leaving her warders to hold her horse quite openly, she dodged about on foot trying to keep carts between herself and him. The pale Aes Sedai could not hide her scent, though. Or if she could, she did not know it was necessary. She was surprised when he tracked her down quickly, and indignant when he marched her to her horse ahead of Stair. Even so, he was well into the hour riding away from Sil Harbor, with the winged guards making their ring of red armor around Barrelane, the two rivers men surrounding the 8 loaded carts that trundled along behind the 3 remaining banners, and Niall grinning for all he was worth. Not to mention trying to chat up the Aes Sedai. Perrin did not know what to do if the fellow really was going mad. As soon as the rise hit Sil Harbor behind him, he felt the loosening of a knot he had not realized was riding between his shoulders. That left only 10 others, and a knot of impatience twisting his belly. Barrelane's obvious sympathy could not loosen those. Niall's gateway took them from the snow-covered field to the small clearing of the traveling ground amid the towering trees, 4 leagues in a step. But Perrin did not wait for the handful of carts to come through. He thought he heard Barrelane make a vexed sound when he booted Stair to a quick trot back toward the camp. Or maybe it was one of the Aes Sedai. Much more likely. There was a sense of stillness when he rode in among the 2 rivers men's tents and huts. The sun still hung not too far off overhead in the gray sky, but there were no cookpots on the fires, and very few of the men gathered around the campfires, holding their cloaks close and peering intently into the flames. A handful were sitting on the rough stools that Ban Craw knew how to make. The rest stood or squatted. No one so much as looked up. Certainly no one came running to take his horse. Not stillness, he realized. Tension. The smell somehow reminded him of a bow drawn to the point of breaking. He could almost hear the creak. As he dismounted in front of the red-striped tent, Daniel appeared from the direction of the low Aiel tents, walking fast. Sulin and Adara, one of the wise ones, were following him, and keeping up easily, though neither appeared to hurry. Sulin's face was a sun-dark leather mask. Adara's, barely revealed by the dark shawl wrapped around her head, was an image of calm. Despite her bulky skirts, she made as little sound as the white-haired maiden, not so much as a faint clink from her golden ivory bracelets and necklaces. Daniel was chewing the edge of one thick mustache, absently pulling his sword an inch out of its rough leather scabbard and shoving it back hard. Pull and shove. He drew a deep breath before speaking. The maidens brought in 5 Shido, Lord Perrin. Arganda took them over to the Gildanan tents to put them to the question. Massima's with them. Perrin brushed aside Massima's presence inside the camp. Why did you let Arganda take them? He asked Adar. Gandalf could not have stopped it. The wise ones were a different proposition. Adara appeared not much older than Perrin, yet her cool blue eyes seemed to have seen far more than he ever would. She folded her arms beneath her breasts in a rattle of bracelets, and with a touch of impatience. Even Shido know how to embrace pain, Perrin Nevarra. It will take days to bring any of them to talk, and there seemed no reason to wait. If Adara's eyes were cool, Sulan's were blue ice. My spear sisters and I could have done it faster ourselves, a little. But then Aluan said you wanted no blows struck. Gerard Arganda is an impatient man, and he mistrusts us. She sounded as though she would have spat if she were not Aiel. You may not learn much in any case. They are stone dogs. They will yield slowly, and as little as possible. In this, it is always necessary to put together a little from one with a little from another to make a picture. Embrace pain. There had to be pain when you put a man to the question. He had not let that thought form in his head before this. But to get Fail back. Have somebody rub Stayer down, he said roughly, thrusting the reins at Daniel. The Gildanan portion of the camp could not have been more different from the rude shelters and haphazardly placed tents of the Two Rivers men. Here, the peaked canvas tents stood in precise rows, most with a steel-tipped cone of lances standing at the entry flaps, with saddled horses tethered at the side, ready to mount. The flicking of the horses' tails and the long streamers in the lances, lifting on a cold breeze, were the only disordered things to be seen. The paths between the tents were all the same width, and a straight line could have been drawn through the rows of cook fires. Even the creases in the canvas, from where the tents had been folded away at the bottom of the carts until the snows came, made straight lines. All orderly and neat. A smell of oatmeal porridge and boiled acorn hung in the air, and some green-coated men were scraping the last of the midday meal from their tin plates with their fingers. Others were already scouring out the cookpots. None showed any sign of tension. They were just eating and doing chores with about equal pleasure. It was something that had to be done. A large knot of men stood gathered in a ring near the sharpened stakes that marked the outer edge of the camp. No more than half wore the green coats and burnished breastplates of Gildanan lancers. Some of the others carried lances or had swords belted over their rumpled coats. Those ranged from fine silk or good wool to the pickings of a rag bag, but none could be called clean except in comparison to So Harbor. You could always tell Massima's men, even from the back. Another smell came to him as he approached the circle of men. The smell of meat roasting, and there was a muffled sound that he tried not to hear. When he began pushing his way through, the soldiers looked around at him and gave way grudgingly. Massima's men started back, muttering about yellow eyes and shadow spawn. Either way, he gained passage to the front. 4 tall men, red-haired or pale in the gray and brown cotton sore, lay bound to their wrists, lashed to their ankles and the small of their backs, stout lengths of branch tied behind their knees and elbows. Their faces were battered and bruised, and they had wadded rags tied between their teeth. The 5th man was naked, staked out between 4 stout pegs driven into the ground, and stretched so tight his sinews stood out. He thrashed as much as his binding allowed, though, and howled into the rags stuffing his mouth, a muffled bellow of agony. Hot coals made a small cluster on his belly, giving off a faint smoke. It was the smell of blistering flesh that Perrin's nose had caught. The coals clung to the stretched man's skin, and every time his writhing managed to throw one off, a grinning fellow in a filthy green silk coat squatting beside him used a pair of tongs to replace it with another from a potful, melting a circle of mud in the ground. Perrin knew him. His name was Hari, and he liked to collect ears strung on a leather cord. Men's ears, women's ears, children's ears. Never minded to Hari. Without thinking, Perrin strode forward and kicked a little pile of coals off the bound man. Some of them struck Hari, who jumped back with a startled squeal that turned to a shriek when his hand came down in the pot. He toppled over sideways, cradling his burned hand and glaring at Perrin, a weasel in a human skin. The savage makes a sham, Bara, Massima said. Perrin had not even noticed the man standing there, face like a scowling stone beneath his shaved scalp, His dark, fevered eyes held a measure of contempt. The scent of madness skittered through the stink of burned flesh. I know them. They pretend to feel pain, but they do not. Not the way other men do. You must be willing and able to hurt a stone to make one of them talk. Arganda, rigid beside Massima, was gripping his sword hilt so hard that his hand shook. Perhaps you are willing to lose your wife, Ibarra, he grated. But I will not lose my queen. It has to be done, Aram said, half pleading, half demanding. He was on Massima's other side, clutching the edges of his green cloak as if to keep his hands from the sword on his back. His eyes were almost as hot as Massima's. You taught me that a man does what he must. Perrin forced his fists to unknot. It had to be done. For Faio. Berylane and the Aes Sedai came pushing through the crowd, Berylane wrinkling her nose slightly at the sight of the man stretched out between the pegs. The three Aes Sedai might have been looking at a piece of wood for all their expression. Idara and Sulan were with them, neither more affected. Some of the Gildanan soldiers frowned at the two Aiel women, muttered under their breath. Massima's rumpled, dirty-faced men glared at Aiel and Aes Sedai alike, but most edged away from the three warders, and those who did not were pulled away by their companions. Some fools knew the limits of stupidity. Massima glared at Berylane with burning eyes before deciding to pretend she did not exist. Some fools knew no limits. Bending, Perrin untied the rag around the peg man's mouth and tugged the wad from between his teeth. He just managed to snatch his hand back from a snap as vicious as any stare could have given. Immediately, the Aielman threw back his head and began to sing in a deep, clear voice, "Wash the spears while the sun climbs high. Wash the spears while the sun falls low. Wash the spears, who fears to die? Wash the spears, no one I know." Massima's laughter rose in the middle of the singing. Perrin's hackles rose too. He had never heard Massima laugh before. It was not a pleasant sound. He did not want to lose a finger, so he pulled his axe out of its belt loop and carefully used the top of the axe head against the man's chin to push his mouth shut. Eyes the color of sky looked up at him out of a sun-dark face, unafraid. The man smiled. "I don't ask you to betray your people," Perrin said. His throat hurt with the effort of keeping his voice steady. "You Shido captured some women. All I want to know is how to get them back. One is named Faio. She's as tall as one of your women, with dark tilted eyes, a strong nose, and a bold mouth. A beautiful woman. You'd remember her if you had seen her. Have you?" Pulling the axe away, he straightened. The Shido stared at him for a moment, then raised his head and began to sing again, never taking his eyes from Perrin. It was a jolly song, the rollicking sound of a dance. "I once met a man who was far from home. His eyes were yellow and his wits were stone. He asked me to hold smoke in my hand, and he said he could show me a watery land. He put his head in the ground and his feet in the air, and said he could dance like a woman fair. He said he could stand till he turned to stone. When I blinked my eyes, he was gone." Letting his head fall back, the Shido chuckled, deep and rich. He could have been lounging at ease on a feather bed. If you can't do this," Aram said desperately, "then go away. I'll help see to it." What had to be done? Perrin looked at the faces around him. Arganda, scowling with hatred, at him as much as the Shido now. Massima, stinking of madness and filled with a scornful hate. You must be willing and able to hurt a stone. Idara, their faces unreadable as the Aes Sedai's, arms folded calmly beneath her breasts. Even Shido know how to embrace pain. It will take days. Sulan, the scar across her cheek still pale on her leathery skin, her gaze level and her scent implacable. They will yield slowly and as little as possible. Berylane, smelling of judgment, a ruler who had sentenced men to death and never lost a night's sleep. What had to be done? Willing and able to hurt a stone. Embrace the pain. Light, Faio. The axe was as light as a feather rising in his hand, and came down like a hammer on the anvil, the heavy blade shearing through the Shido's left wrist. The man grunted in pain, then reared up convulsively with a snarl, deliberately spraying the blood that gouted from his wrist across Perrin's face. "Heal him," Perrin said to the Aes Sedai, stepping back. He did not try to wipe his face. The blood was seeping into his beard. He felt hollow. He could not have lifted the axe again if he had to for his life. "Are you mad?" Masuri said angrily. "We cannot give the man back his hand." "I said heal him," he growled. Sionid was already moving, though, lifting her skirts to glide across the ground and kneel at the man's head. He was biting at his severed wrist, trying futilely to stem the flow of blood with the pressure of his teeth. But there was no fear in his eyes, or in his smell. None. Sionid gripped the Shido's head, and suddenly he convulsed again, flinging his arm out wildly. The spray of blood dwindled as he jerked, and was gone before he slumped back to the ground, gray-faced. Unsteadily, he raised the stump of his left arm to look at the smooth skin that now covered the end. If there was a scar, Perrin could not see it. The man bared teeth at him. He still did not smell afraid. Sionid slumped too, as if she had strained it to her limit. Alhara and Winter took a step forward, and she waved them away, rising by herself with a heavy sigh. "I've been told you can hold up for days and still say next to nothing," Perrin said. His voice sounded too loud in his ears. "I don't have time for you to show how tough you are, or how brave. I know you're brave and tough, but my wife's been a prisoner too long. You'll be separated and asked about some women, whether you've seen them and where. That's all I want to know. There'll be no hot coals or anything else, just questions. But if anybody refuses to answer, or if your answers are too different, then everybody loses something." He was surprised to find that he could lift the axe after all. The blade was smeared with red. "2 hands and 2 feet, he said coldly. Light, he sounded like ice. He felt like ice to his bones. "That means you get 4 chances to answer the same. And if you all hold out, I still won't kill you. I'll find a village to leave you in, some place that will let you beg, somewhere the boys will toss a coin to the fierce Aielmen with no hands or feet. You think on it, and decide whether it's worth keeping my wife from me." Even Massimo was staring at him as if he had never seen the man standing there with an axe. When he turned to go, Massimo's men and the Gildanon alike parted in front of him as though to let a whole fist of Trollocs through. He found the hedge of sharpened stakes in front of him, and the forest 100 paces or so beyond, but he did not change direction. Carrying the axe, he walked until huge trees surrounded him, and the smell of the camp was left behind. The smell of blood he carried with him sharpened the tapping. There was no running from that. He could not have said how long he walked through the snow. He barely noticed the sharpening slant of bars of light that sliced the shadows beneath the forest canopy. The blood was thick on his face, in his beard, beginning to dry. How many times had he said he would do anything to get Fail back? The man did what he had to. For Fail, anything. Abruptly, he raised the axe behind his head in both hands, and hurled it as hard as he could. It spun end over end and slammed into the thick trunk of an oak with a solid thunk. Letting out a breath that seemed locked in his lungs, he sank down on a rough stone outcrop that stuck up as high and as broad as a bench, and put his elbows on his knees. "You can show yourself now, Elias," he said wearily. "I can smell you there." The other man stepped lightly out of the shadows, yellow eyes glowing faintly beneath the wide brim of his hat. The Aiel were noisy compared to him. Adjusting his long knife, he took a seat beside Perrin on the outcrop, but for a time he merely sat combing his fingers through the gray-streaked beard that fanned across his chest. He nodded toward the axe stuck in the side of the oak. "I told you once to keep that till you got to like using it too much. Did you start liking it? Back there?" Perrin shook his head hard. "No, not that. But what, boy? I think you almost have Massima scared. Only you smell scared, too." "About time he was scared of something," Perrin muttered, shrugging uncomfortably. Some things were hard to give voice. Maybe it was time to, though. The axe. I didn't notice it the first time, only looking back. That was the night I met Gaul. The White Bucks tried to kill us.
I'll be right back.
Later, fighting Trollocs in the
You
Two
gotta make a
Rivers,
pit stop.
I wasn't sure. But then at
This
Demise
whole
Wells, I was.
thing kind of sucks.
I'm afraid in a battle, Elias. Afraid and sad, because maybe I'll never see Fail again. His heart clenched until his chest hurt. Fail. Only, I've heard Grady and Neil talk about how it is holding the one power. They say they feel more alive. I'm too frightened to spit in a battle, but I feel more alive than any time except when I'm holding Fail. I don't think I could stand it if I came to feel that way about what I just did back there. I don't think Fail would have me back if I came to that. Elias snorted. I don't think you have that in you, boy. Listen, danger takes different men in different ways. Some are cold as clockwork, but you never struck me as the cold sort. When your heart starts pounding, it heats your blood. Stands to reason it heightens your senses too, makes you aware. Maybe you'll die in a few minutes, maybe in a heartbeat. But you're not dead now, and you know it from your teeth to your toenails. Just the way things are.
How you doing, Sasquatch?
I would like to believe that, Aaron said simply.
Hope you're doing well.
Live as long as I have, Elias replied in a dry voice, and you'll believe. Till then, just take it that I've lived longer than you have, and I've been there before you. The two of them sat looking at the axe. Aaron wanted to believe. The blood on his axe looked black now. Blood had never looked so black before. How long had it been?
Oh, yeah.
From the angle of the light sifting through the trees, the sun was falling. His ears caught the crunch of hooves in the snow, slowly coming toward him. Minutes later, Niald and Arm appeared, the one-time thinker pointing out tracks and the Ashaman shaking his head impatiently.
About to do a dab.
It was a
and
clear
then,
trail,
smoke
but
a
in
joint.
truth, Aaron would not have bet on Niald being able to follow it. He was a city man.
Oh, damn, that sucks, Sasquatch.
Again, I thought we ought to wait till
That
your blood
always sets
cooled,
me break a bowl.
Niald said, leaning on the saddle and studying Aaron. Me? I think it can't get any cooler. He nodded, a touch of satisfaction around his mouth. He was accustomed to people being afraid of him, because of his black coat and what it represented. They talked, Aram said, and they all gave the same answers. His scowl said he did not like the answers. I think the threat of leaving them to beg frightened them more than your axe. But they say they've never seen the Lady Fail, or any of the others. We could try the coals again. They might remember then. Did he sound eager? To find Fail or to use the coals? Elias grimaced. They'll just give you back the answers you've already given them now. Tell you what you want to hear. It was a small chance anyway. There's thousands of Shido and thousands of prisoners. A man could live his whole life among that many people and never meet more than a few hundred to remember. Then we have to kill them, Aram said grimly. Sulan said the maidens made sure to take them when they had no weapons so they could be questioned. They won't just settle down to be Gaishain. If even one escapes, he can let the Shido know we're here. Then they'll be coming after us. Perrin's joints felt rusted, aching as he stood up. He could not just let the Shido go. They can be guarded, Aram. Haste had almost lost him Fail completely, and he had been hasty again. Hasty. Such a mild word for cutting off a man's hand. And to no purpose. He had always tried to think carefully and move carefully. He had to think now, but every thought hurt. Fail was lost in a sea of white-clad prisoners. Maybe other Gaishain would know where she is, he muttered, turning back toward the camp. But how to put his hands on any of the Shido's Gaishain? They were never allowed outside the camp except under guard. What about that, boy? Elias asked. Perrin knew what he meant without looking. The axe. Leave it for whoever finds it. His voice turned harsh. Maybe some fool gleeman will make a story out of it. He strode away toward the camp, never looking back. With its empty loop, the thick belt around his waist was too light. All to no purpose. 3 days later, the carts returned from So Harbor, heavy laden, and Bulwer entered Perrin's tent with a tall, unshaven man wearing a dirty woolen coat and a sword that looked much better cared for. At first, Perrin did not recognize him behind an untrimmed month's growth of beard. Then he caught the man's scent. I never expected to see you again, he said. Bulwer blinked, as much as a gasp of startlement from anyone else. Doubtless the bird-like little man had been looking forward to presenting a surprise. I've been searching
Definitely a lot better
for
than
Megden, Talonvor said roughly.
what you call
But the
it.
Shido moved faster than I
It
could.
being the whole
Mr.
bong.
Bulwer
That
says
would
you know where
suck.
she is. Bulwer gave the younger man a sharp look, but his voice remained as dry and emotionless as his scent. Master Talonvor reached So Harbor just before I left, my lord. It was the merest chance that I encountered him, but perhaps a fortunate chance. He may have some allies for you. I will let him tell it. Talonvor frowned at his boots and said nothing. Allies? Baron prompted. Nothing less than an army would be much use, but I'll take any aid you can bring. Talonvor looked at Bulwer, who returned a half bow and a blandly encouraging smile. The unshaven man drew a deep breath. 15,000 Shonchan, near enough. Most are Terrabonners, actually, but they ride under Shonchan banners. And they have at least a dozen to money. His voice quickened with urgency, the need to finish before Perrin could cut him off. I know it's like taking help from the Dark One, but they're hunting the Shido too, and I'd take the Dark One's help to free Megden. For a moment,
Damn, that
Perrin
sucks.
stared at the two men, Talonvor nervously thumbing his sword hilt, Bulwer like a sparrow waiting to see which way a cricket would hop. Shonchan. And Damoni. Yes, that would be like taking the Dark One's help. Sit down and tell me about these Shonchan, he said. Chapter 28. A Cluster of Rosebuds. From the day they left Ebudar, traveling with Val and Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders, was every bit as bad as Matt's darkest thoughts had made it. For one thing, it rained almost every day for a few hours, and once for 3 days running.
Hey, Fire, how you
Cold
doing?
winter rain, in downpours little short of snow and icy drizzles, that slowly soaked a coat through and left you shivering before you knew it. Water ran off the hard-packed road as if it had been paved in stone, leaving at worst a thin slick of mud, but that long train of wagons and horses and people covered little enough ground when the sun shone. In the beginning, the showfolk had been all eagerness to leave the city, where lightning sank ships in the night and strange murders had everyone looking over their shoulders, to be away from a jealous Shonchan nobleman who would be hunting his wife furiously and might take out his anger on anyone associated with spiriting her out of his clutches. In the beginning, they pressed ahead as fast as the horses could pull the wagons, urging the animals for a quicker step, another mile. But every mile seemed to make them feel that much farther from danger, that much safer. And by the first afternoon, I have to take care of the horses, Luca explained, watching the team unhitched from his ridiculously painted wagon and led away to the horse lines through a light drizzle. The sun still sat little more than halfway down to the horizon, but already gray tendrils were rising from the smoke holes of tents and the metal chimneys of the box-like living wagons. Nobody's chasing us, and it's a long way to Lugard. Good horses are hard to come by and expensive. Luca gave a sour frown and shook his head. Mention of expense always soured him. He was tight with a penny except where his wife was concerned. Not many places between here and there worth stopping more than a day. Most villages won't provide a full crowd even if the whole population turns out, and you can never tell how a town will be until you set up. You're not paying me enough to give up what I can earn, though. Pitching his embroidered crimson cloak closer against the damp, he glanced over his shoulder toward his wagon. The smell of something bitter drifted through the light rain. Matt was not sure he would want to eat anything Luca's wife cooked. You're certain nobody is chasing us, right, Coffin? Irritably tugging his woolen cap lower, Matt stalked away through the brightly colored sprawl of tents and wagons, grinding his teeth. Not paying enough? For what he had offered, Luca should have been willing to run his animals all the way to Lugard. Well, not exactly run. He did not want to kill horses after all. But that puffed-up popinjay should have been willing to bloody push hard. Not far from Luca's wagon, Chell Vannon was seated on a three-legged stool that he overlapped, stirring some sort of dark stew in a small kettle that hung over a small fire. Rain dripped into the kettle from the drooping brim of his hat, but the fat man did not seem to notice or care. Gorderon and Fergan, two of the Red Arms, grumbled curses as they drove pegs into the muddy ground for the guy ropes of the dirty brown canvas tent they shared with Harnan and Metwin. And with Vannon, too, but Bannon possessed skills that he considered put him above raising tents, and the Red Arms agreed with only a little reluctance. Bannon was an experienced farrier, but more importantly, he was the best tracker and the best horse thief in the country, unlikely as that seemed to look at him, and you could name the country you chose. Fergan caught sight of Matt and bit off an oath as his hammer missed the tent peg and hit his thumb. Dropping the hammer, he stuck the thumb in his mouth and squatted there complaining shrilly around it. "We're going to have to be out on this all night guarding those women, my lord. Can't you hire some of those horse handlers to do this so we can at least stay dry till we have to get wet?" Gorderon poked Fergan's shoulder with a thick finger. He was as wide as Fergan was skinny, and a tyrant despite his gray eyes. "Horse handlers will put up the tent and steal everything in it that's loose, Fergan." Another poke. "You want one of those light fingers walking off with my crossbow or my saddle? That's a good saddle." A third poke nearly pushed Fergan over sideways. "We don't get this tent up, and Harnan will have us standing guard all night." Fergan glowered and grumbled, but he picked up his hammer, wiping the mud off on his coat. He was a good enough soldier, but not very bright. Bannon spat through the gap in his teeth, just missing the kettle. The stew smelled wonderful after what Littell was making, but Matt decided he was not going to eat here either. Tapping his wooden spoon on the rim of the kettle to clean it, the fat man looked up at Matt through heavy-lidded eyes. His round face often looked half asleep, but only a fool believed it. "At this rate, we'll reach Lugard about the end of summer, if we ever do." "We will, Vannon," Matt said, more confidently than he felt at the moment. The rough woolen coat he had donned dry a few hours ago only shed rain in spots, and water was trickling down his back. It was hard to feel confident with icy rain sliding down your backbone. "Winter's almost done. We'll move faster once spring comes. You'll see. Come the middle of spring and we'll be in Lugard." He was not so sure of that either. They covered no more than 2 leagues that first day, and after that, 2.5 made a good day. Not many places could be called towns along the Great North Road, a name that began to change very quickly as the show crept north. People called it the Ebudar Road or the Ferry Road, or sometimes just the road, as if there were only one. But Lucas stopped at every last town, real or so-called, walled or jumped-up village with 6 streets and a rough-paved excuse for a town square. Near half a day went into just getting the show set up, and the canvas wall erected around it with a huge red-lettered blue banner hung across the entrance. Valon Luca's Grand Traveling Show. It was just not in Luca to pass up the chance of a crowd, or the coins in their purses, or the chance to flourish one of his bright red cloaks and bask in their adulation. Luca liked that almost as much as the coin. Almost. The strangeness of the performers and the caged animals from far-off lands were sufficient to pull people. The animals from not so far were enough, for that matter. Few had been far enough into the countryside to see a bear, much less a lion. Only heavy rain lessened the crowd. And when the rain was too stiff, the jugglers and acrobats refused to perform anyway without some sort of covering overhead, which made Lucas stalk about in a sullen snit and talk wildly of finding enough canvas tarps to shelter every act, or having a tent made large enough to hold the entire show. 1 tent. The man was nothing if not grandiose in his ambitions. Why not a palace on wheels while he was about it? If Luca and the slow way the show moved had been all Matt had to worry about, though, he would have been a happy man. Sometimes 2 or 3 slow-moving trains of Shanshan settlers who had gotten an early start passed with their strangely shaped peaked wagons and odd-looking cattle or sheep or goats before the first wagon from the show began to move. Sometimes columns of Shanshan soldiers overtook them as they ambled along at a slow walk,
Right.
ranks of men wearing helmets like huge
get
insects' heads, stepping
good
out
boy.
smartly, and columns of horsemen with their armor of overlapping plates painted in stripes. Once, the riders were on Torm, bronze-scaled creatures like horse-sized cats, except for having 3 eyes anyway. 20 or so of them snaking along in a sinuous lope faster than a horse could trot. Neither the riders nor their mounts gave the show a second glance, but the show's horses went wild as the Torm passed, screaming and rearing in the traces. The lions and leopards and bears roared in their cages, and the peculiar deer flung themselves against the bars trying to flee. It took hours to quiet everything down enough for the wagons to move again, and Luca insisted on having the caged animals' scrapes seen to first. His animals were a large investment. Twice, officers in thin-plumed helmets decided to check the warrant for Lucas' horses, and Matt oozed cold sweat the size of grapes until they moved on again, satisfied. As the show crept north, the numbers of Seanchan on the road dwindled, yet he still sweated when he saw another party, soldiers or settlers, either one. Maybe Soroth really was keeping Tuon's disappearance a secret, but the Seanchan would be searching for her. All it would take was one meddlesome officer who actually compared the numbers on the warrant with the number of horses. He would search the wagons with a fine-tooth comb after that for certain. Just one officious Suldam who thought there might be a woman who could channel among the jugglers and tumblers and contortionists. He sweated plums. Unfortunately, not everyone had a proper regard for their own skins. Outside a fly-speck village called Weeson, a thatch-roofed little cluster of houses where not even Luca thought 2 coppers could be shaken loose, Matt stood with a heavy woolen cloak pulled around him in a driving rain and watched the 3 Aes Sedai steal back into the show as the sun set. Thunder boomed in the distance. They were swathed in dark cloaks with the hoods well up, yet he had no doubts who they were. In the downpour, they passed within 10 feet without seeing him, but the silver medallion hanging beneath his shirt went cold against his chest. At least one of them was channeling, or holding the power anyway. Burn him, they were all 3 mad as loons. No sooner did the Aes Sedai vanish among the wagons and tents than 3 more cloaked shapes appeared, hurrying after them. One of these women had a sharper eye, raising a hand to point at him, but the others only paused, and then they scurried after the Aes Sedai together. He started to curse, then left it unuttered. He was beyond that. If he named the people he wanted wandering around where a Seanchan patrol might see them, the Aes Sedai and the Suldam would come about, even with Tuon and Selucia. I wonder what they want, Noel said behind him, and Matt gave a jump that let a torrent of rain into his cowl and down his neck. He wished the knobbly old man would quit sneaking up on him. I intend to find out, he muttered, jerking his cloak straight. He hardly knew why he bothered. His coat was only a little damp, but his linen shirt was already soaked. Oddly enough, Noel was no longer with him when he reached the gray-streaked wagon with its fading whitewash where the Aes Sedai and Suldam slept. The man liked sticking his nose in everywhere. Maybe he had decided he was wet enough. Blerick and Fen were already wrapped in their blankets beneath the wagon, apparently oblivious to rain or mud, but he would not have wagered on either being asleep. Indeed, one sat up as he squelched up to the wagon. Whichever it was, he said nothing, yet Matt could feel the man's eyes. He did not hesitate, though, and he did not bother with knocking. The interior was crowded with all 6 women on their feet, dripping cloaks still in hand. 2 lamps, mounted in gimbals on the walls, gave a good light, better than he could have wished for, in a way. 6 faces swiveled toward him with those frozen looks women gave a man when he put a foot where they did not want it. The air in the wagon smelled of damp wool and felt as if lightning had just struck, or might at any moment. Rain drummed on the roof and thunder rolled, but the fox-head medallion felt no cooler than any other piece of silver. Maybe Blerick and Fen had let him come inside thinking he would get his head snapped off. Maybe they just wanted to stay out of this themselves. But then, a warder was ready to die if his Aes Sedai decided it was necessary. Not Matt Cawthon. He pushed the door shut with his hip. It hardly gave him a twinge anymore. Seldom, anyway. When he challenged them, Edicina fiercely, shaking out the black hair that spilled down her back. I am grateful to you for rescuing me from the Seanchan, Master Cawthon, and I will show my gratitude. But there are limits. I am not your servant to be ordered about. There were no Seanchan in the village, and we kept our faces hidden. There was no need to send your watchdogs after us. The look she shot at the 3 Seanchan women could have fried eggs. Edicina was being over-nervous about anyone with a Seanchan accent. She wanted some of her own back, and the Suldam were close to hand. Matt was counting on that fabled Aes Sedai self-control to keep matters short of violence. He hoped it was not already stretched too far to hold. Those old memories recalled Aes Sedai going up like illuminators' wares. Bethamin's dark face showed no sign of alarm. She had finished shaking out her cloak and hanging it on a peg while Edicina was speaking, then smoothed her dress over her hips. Tonight she wore faded green petticoats. She complained that the Ebudari garment was indecent, and he supposed that he would have to find her something else now they were away from the coast, but she did fill out that very low neckline nicely. She sounded too much like a mother for his taste, though. They did keep their faces hidden, my lord, she drawled, and they stayed together. No one tried to sneak off. Very well behaved, all in all. A mother praising her children, or maybe a dog trainer praising the dogs. Yellow-haired Sita nodded approvingly. Definitely a dog trainer. If my lord wishes to keep them confined, Renner said fulsomely, we can always use the Idam. They really shouldn't be trusted loose. She even offered him a bow, in the Shan way, bending herself at a sharp right angle. Her big brown eyes looked hopeful. Teslin gasped and clutched her wet cloak to her bosom. She certainly was not over her fear of the Suldam, for all she looked as though she could eat nails. Jolene, haughty as ever, drew herself up, eyes flashing. Aes Sedai serenity or no, lightning might as well strike when Jolene's eyes started flashing. It was often so with pretty women. No, Matt said hastily. There's no need for that. You give those things to me and I'll get rid of them. Light, why had he ever saddled himself with these women? What seemed the best idea at the time could look pure quill stupid in hindsight. All of you just have to be careful. We're not 30 miles from Abu Dar yet. The roads are full of bloody Shan. He gave an apologetic look to the three Shan women. They were on his side, after all, in a manner of speaking. They had nowhere else to go except to Guinan, and they had realized who had the money. Bethamin's eyebrows twitched upward in surprise. Shan nobles did not apologize, even with a glance. Shan soldiers did pass through the village yesterday, Teslin said, her Illianer accent particularly strong. Jolene's flashing eyes shifted to her, but she took no notice beyond turning away to hang up her own cloak. They did ask questions about strangers on the road, and some did complain about being sent north. Teslin glanced over her shoulder at the Suldam, then jerked her eyes away and took a deep breath. It does seem the return be aimed east. The soldiers did believe the ever-victorious army will present Ilian to their empress before the end of spring. The city itself, and all the rest. Supposedly, Aes Sedai gave up the lands of their birth when they went to the White Tower, but to any Ilianer, the city of Ilian was the city, capital City, and you could hear the capital. That's good, Matt said half to himself, thinking. Soldiers talked out of turn all the time. That was one reason you did not tell your plans to every trooper until the last minute. Teslin's thin eyebrows rose, and he added, It means the road to Lugard will be clear most of the way. Teslin's nod was curt and not very pleased. What Aes Sedai were supposed to do, and what they did, were often widely different. We didn't speak to anyone, my lord, only watched the girls, Bethamin said, even more slowly than usual, and Shan usually talked like honey, pouring in a snowstorm. She was clearly in charge among the three Suldam, but she looked at each of the others before going on. In Abu Dar, all the talk in the Suldam quarters was of Ilian. A fat land and a fat city, where many would earn new names. And wealth. She tossed that in as if wealth hardly counted alongside a new name. We should have realized you'd want to know about such things. Another deep breath almost popped her out of that dress. If you have any questions, my lord, we'll tell you what we know. Rena made him another bow, her face eager, and Sita piped up with, We could listen in the towns and villages where we stop too, my lord. The girls can be shifty, but you can trust us. Why, when a woman offered to help you, did she always start by sticking you in a pot of hot water and stoking up the fire? Jolene's face became a disdainful mask of ice. The Shan women were beneath her notice. She made that clear with a glance. It was Matt Bloody Cawthon who received her freezing gaze. Edicina's mouth thinned, and she tried to stare holes in him and the Suldam both. Even Teslin managed indignation. She was grateful for rescue too, but she was Aes Sedai, and she directed her frown at him. He suspected she would jump like a startled frog if one of the Suldam clapped her hands. What I want, he explained patiently, is for all of you to stay with the wagons. You had to be patient with women, including Aes Sedai. He was bloody well learning that by heart. One whisper there's an Aes Sedai with this show, and we'll be hip-deep in Shan hunting for her. Rumors of Shan with the show won't serve us any better. Either way, somebody will come to find out what's behind it sooner or later, and we'll all be in the pickling kettle. Don't flaunt yourselves. You need to stay low till we get closer to Lugard. That isn't so much to ask now, is it? Lightning lit up the wagon's windows with a blue flash, and thunder crashed overhead so close it rattled the wagon. It was too much to ask, apparently, as the days wore on. Oh, the Aes Sedai kept their hoods well up when they went outside. The rain gave enough excuse for that. The rain and the cold. But one or another rode on the wagon seat as often as not, and they made no real effort to pass as servants around the showfolk. Not that they admitted who they were, of course, or ordered anyone about, or even spoke to anyone much besides each other. But what servant clearly expected people to move out of her way? They went into the villages, too, and sometimes the towns, as if they were sure there were no Shonchan there. When an Aes Sedai was sure of something, it had to be true. Twice they came scurrying back when they found a town half full of settlers on their way north. They told him what they learned on their visits. He thought they did. Teslin did seem grateful after an Aes Sedai fashion, and Edicina after a fashion. Despite their differences, Jolene, Teslin, and Edicina stuck together like herded geese. If you saw one, you saw all three. Likely that was because when you saw them taking a stroll, all neatly cloaked and hidden as they were, a minute later Bethamin and Rena and Sita appeared trailing after them. Oh, so casually, but never letting the girls out of sight. The goose herds. A blind man could see there was tension between the two groups of women. A blind man could see none of them were servants. The Suldam had held respected positions of authority, and they moved almost as arrogantly as the Aes Sedai. He was stuck with the story, though. Bethamin and the other two were as leery of other Shonchan as the Aes Sedai were. Yet they also followed the Aes Sedai when they went into a village or town, and Bethamin always reported the tidbits they had picked up by eavesdropping, with Rena wearing an ingratiating smile and Sita chirping in that the girls had missed this or that, or claimed not to have heard. You could never be sure with someone who had the audacity to call herself Aes Sedai. Maybe he should reconsider having them leashed, just till everything was safe. Their tales really were not that different from what the sisters told him. Townsfolk's talk of what they had overheard from Shonchan passing through. Many of the settlers were nervous, their heads full of tales about savage Aiel ravaging through Altara, though the local people all said that was up north somewhere. It seemed someone higher might be thinking the same, though, because many settlers had been diverted east toward Ilion. An alliance had been concluded with someone powerful who was expected to give the High Lady Suroth access to many lands. The women refused to be convinced that they need not listen for rumors. They never quite got around to handing over the Eidam either. In truth, those silvery leashes and the 3 Suldam were the only real lever he had with the Aes Sedai. Gratitude. From an Aes Sedai? Ha! Not that he really thought about putting those collars on the sisters again. Not often, anyway. He was well and truly stuck. He truly did have no need of what the Suldam and Aes Sedai learned. He had better sources, people he trusted. Well, he trusted Tom, when the white-haired gleeman could be routed out from playing snakes and foxes with Oliver, or mooning over a much-creased letter he carried tucked in the breast of his coat. Tom could walk into a common room, tell a story, maybe juggle a bit, and walk out knowing what was in the head of every man there. Matt trusted Julian, too. He did almost as well as Tom without juggling or storytelling. But Julian always insisted on taking Thera with him, demurely clutching his arm as they strolled into a town. To get her used to freedom again, the man said. She smiled up at Julian, those big eyes shining darkly, that full little mouth asking to be kissed. Maybe she had been Panarch of Terabon, the way Julian and Tom claimed, but Matt was beginning to doubt it. He had heard some of the contortionists joking about how the Terraboner serving girl was wearing the tyrant thief catcher out till he could barely walk. Panarch or serving girl, though, Thera still started to kneel any time she heard a drawling accent. Matt figured that any Shonchan who asked her a question would get everything she knew, beginning with Julian Sandar and ending with which wagon the Aes Sedai were in, all answers delivered from her knees. Thera was a bigger danger than Aes Sedai and Suldam put together, in his book. Julian bridled at the slightest suggestion his woman might be unreliable, though, and spun his bamboo staff as if he was considering cracking Matt's head for him. There was no solution, but Matt found a stopgap, a way to get a little warning if the worst occurred. Of course I can follow them, Noel said, with a gap-toothed grin that said it would be child's play. Laying a gnarled finger alongside his bent nose, he slipped the other knobbly hand beneath his coat, where he kept his knives. Are you sure it wouldn't be better just to make sure she can't talk to anyone? Just a suggestion, lad. If you say not, then not. Matt most emphatically said not. He had killed one woman in his life and left another to be butchered. He was not going to add a third to his soul. It seems Suroth might have made an alliance with some king, Julian reported with a smile over a cup of mulled wine. At least Thera seemed to be making him smile more. She huddled beside Julian's stool in their cramped tent, her head lying on his lap, and he stroked her hair softly with his free hand. At least there's considerable talk of some powerful new ally, and those settlers are all frightened out of their wits by Aiel. Most of the settlers seem to have been sent east, Tom said, peering sadly into his cup. As Julian grew happier day by day, he seemed to grow sadder. Noel was outshadowing Julian and Thera, and Lopen and Nerim were sitting cross-legged at the back of the tent. But the two Karian and serving men had their mending baskets out, and were examining Matt's good coats from Ebudar for any repairs they thought necessary, so the small tent still seemed crowded. And a great many soldiers, too, Tom went on. Everything says they're going to fall on Ilion like a hammer. Well, at least he knew he was hearing the unvarnished truth when he heard it from them. No Aes Sedai spinning words in their heads or Suldam trying to smarm their way into his good graces. Bethamin and Sita had even learned to curtsy. Somehow he felt more comfortable with Rena bending herself double. It seemed honest. Strange, but honest. For himself, town or village, Matt took no more than a quick look around with his collar turned up and his cap pulled down before heading back to the show. He seldom wore a cloak. A cloak could make it difficult to use the knives he carried tucked about his person. Not that he expected to need them. It was just a prudent precaution. There was no drinking, no dancing, and no gambling. Especially no gambling. The sound of dice rattling on a table in an inn's common room pulled at him, but his sort of luck with dice was bound to be remarked, even if it did not lead to somebody pulling a knife, and in this part of Altara both men and women carried knives tucked behind their belts and were ready to use them. He wanted to pass through unnoticed, so he walked by the dice games, nodded coolly to the tavern maids who smiled at him, and never drank more than a cup of wine, and usually not that. After all, he had work to do back at the show. Work of a sort. He had begun it the very first night after leaving Ebudar, and a lot done it was. I need you to go with me, he had said then, pulling open the cupboard built into the side of the wagon beneath his bed. He kept his chest of gold in there, all honestly come by through gambling. As honestly as he could, anyway. The greater part came from one horse race, and his luck was no better than any other man's with horses. For the rest, if a man wanted to toss dice or play at cards or pitch coins, he had to be ready to lose. Doman, seated on the other bed, rubbing a hand over the bristle on his shaved scalp, had learned that lesson. The fellow should have been willing to sleep on the floor like a good Sojin, but in the beginning he had insisted on flipping a coin with Matt each night for the second bed. Eginin got the first, of course. Tossing coins was as easy as dice, as long as the coin did not land on edge, the way it sometimes did for him. But Doman had made the offer, not him. Until Matt had won 4 times straight, and then the 5th night the coin did land on edge, 3 times in a row. They took turn and turn about now. But it was still Doman's turn for the floor tonight. Finding the smallish wash leather bag he was after, he stuffed it into his coat pocket and straightened, pushing the cupboard shut with his foot. You have to face her sometime, he said, and I need you to smooth things over. He needed someone to attract Tuon's ire, someone to make him seem acceptable by comparison. But he could not say that, could he? You're a Shan noble, and you can keep me from putting my boot in my mouth. Why do you need to smooth things over? Eginen's drawl was hard as a saw. She stood against the wagon's door with her fists on her hips, blue eyes auguring out from beneath her long black wig. Why do you need to see her? Haven't you done enough? Don't tell me you're afraid of her, Matt scoffed, dodging the question. What answer could he give that did not sound insane? You could tuck her under your arm almost as easily as I could. But I promised not to let her cut your head off or beat you up. Eginen, do not be afraid of anything, boy, Doman growled protectively. If she does not want to go, then you trot off to court the girl by yourself. Stay the night if you choose. Eginin continued to glare at Matt, or through him. Then she glanced at Dolman, her shoulders slumped a little, and she snatched her cloak from its peg on the wall. "Get a move on, Carthen," she growled. "If it has to be done, best it's done and over with." She was out of the wagon in a flash, and Matt had to hurry to catch her up. You could almost think she did not want to be alone with Dolman, as little sense as that made. Outside the windowless purple wagon, black in the night, a shadow shifted in the deeper shadows. The sickle moon came out from behind the clouds long enough for Matt to recognize Harnon's lantern jaw. "All quiet, my lord," the file leader said. Matt nodded and took a deep breath, feeling for the wash-leather bag in his pocket. The air was clean, washed by the rain, and away from the horse lines. Tuan must be relieved to be away from the dung smell and the rank odor of the animal cages. The performers' wagons to his left were as dark as the canvas-topped storage wagons to his right. No use waiting any longer. He pushed Eginin up the purple wagon's steps ahead of him. There were more people inside than he expected. Sitala was seated on one of the beds, working her embroidery hoop again, and Selucia stood at the far end, scowling beneath her headscarf. But Noel was sitting on the other bed, apparently lost in thought, and Tuan sat cross-legged on the floor, playing snakes and foxes with Olver. The boy twisted around with a wide-mouthed grin that almost split his face when Matt came in. "Noel has been telling us about Kodensin, Matt," he exclaimed. "That's another name for Shara. Did you know the Ayad tattoo their faces? That's what they call women who can channel in Shara." "No, I didn't," Matt said, settling a grim eye on Noel. It was bad enough that Bannon and the Red Arms were teaching the boy bad habits, not to mention what he was picking up from Julian and Tom, without Noel filling his head with made-up nonsense. Suddenly Noel slapped his thigh and sat up straight. "I remember now," he said, and then the fool began to recite.
"Battery low. Battery. 10%.
"That makes the ravens fly. Luck his soul, the lightning his eye. He snatches the moons from out of the sky." The broken-nosed old man looked around as if just realizing anyone else was there. "I've been trying to remember that. It's from the prophecies of the dragon." "Very interesting, Noel," Matt muttered. Those colors whirled in his head just the way they had that morning when the Aes Sedai were panicking. They flashed away without making a picture this time, but he felt as cold as if he had spent a night sleeping under a bush in his skin. The last thing on earth he needed was anybody else linking him to the prophecies. "Maybe sometime you can recite the whole thing for us. But not tonight, eh?" Tuan looked up at him through her eyelashes, a black porcelain doll in a dress that was too big for her. Light, but she had long lashes. She ignored Eginin as if the other woman did not exist, and in truth, Eginin was doing her best to appear part of a cabinet built into the wall. So much for hoping for a diversion. "He doesn't mean to be rude," Tuan murmured in that slow honey drawl. "He just has never been trained in manners. But it is late, Master Charin. Time for Olver to be in bed. Perhaps you will escort him to his tent? We'll play again another time, Olver. Would you like me to teach you to play stones?" Olver most emphatically would. He almost wriggled saying so. The boy liked anything that gave him a chance to smile at a woman, not to mention a chance to say things that should have gotten him slapped till his ears swelled up bigger than they already were. If Matt ever found out which of his uncles was teaching him that. But the lad gathered the pieces of his game and carefully rolled up the line-marked cloth without a second urging. He even made a very good leg, thanking the high lady before letting Noel lead him from the wagon. Matt nodded approvingly. He had taught the boy how to make a leg, but the boy usually added a leer for a pretty woman. If he ever found out who... "You have a reason for interrupting me, Toy?" Tuan said in cool tones. "It is late, and I was thinking of going to sleep." He made a leg and gave her his best smile. He could be polite even if she was not. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right. These wagons are uncomfortable on the road. And I know you aren't happy with the clothes I could find you. I thought this might make you feel a little better." Fishing the leather bag from his pocket, he presented it with a flourish. Women always liked that little extra flourish. Selucia tensed, blue eyes sharpening, but Tuan waggled her slim fingers, and the bosomy maid subsided. A little. Matt liked feisty women by and large, but if she ruined this, he was going to paddle her bottom. He hung on to his smile with an effort and even managed to ratchet it up a notch. Tuan turned the bag over her hands several times before untying the drawstrings and spilling what it contained into her lap, a heavy necklace of gold and carved amber. An expensive piece, and Shanchan work to boot. He was proud of finding the thing. It had been the property of an acrobat who had it from a Shanchan officer whose fancy she caught, but she had been willing to sell now that her officer was left behind. It did not suit her skin, whatever that meant. He smiled and waited. Jewels always softened a woman's heart. No one's reaction was quite what he expected, though. Tuan lifted the necklace in front of her face with both hands, studying it as if she had never seen such a thing before. Selucia's lip curled in a sneer.
Just a second.
Satala set her embroidery down on her knees and looked at him, the large golden hoops in her ears swaying as she shook her head. Abruptly, Tuan thrust the necklace back over her shoulder toward Selucia. "It does not suit me," she said. "Would you like it, Selucia?" Matt's smile slipped a little. The cream-skinned woman took the necklace between thumb and forefinger, as if holding a dead rat by the tail. "A piece for a shade dancer to wear with her veil," she said wryly. With a twist of her wrist, she hurled the necklace at Aginin, snapping, "Put it on." Aginin caught the thing just before it hit her face. Matt's smile slid the rest of the way off his. He expected an explosion, but Aginin immediately fumbled open the clasp and pushed her heavy wig back to fasten it behind her neck. Her face might have been molded from snow for all the expression on it. "Turn," Selucia commanded, and it was a command without any doubt. "Let me see." Aginin turned. Stiff as a fence post, but she turned. Satala looked at her intently with a puzzled shake of her head. Then he gave Matt a different head shake before returning to her embroidery. Women had as many ways of shaking their heads as they had looks. This one said he was a fool, and if he did not catch the finer nuances, he was just as glad. He did not think he would have liked them. Burn him, he bought a necklace for Tuan, who gave it to Selucia right in front of him, and now it was Aginin's? "She came for a new name," Tuan said musingly. "What does she call herself?" "Lyle Wynn," Selucia replied. "A fitting name for a shea dancer. Lyle Wynn Shipless, perhaps?" Tuan nodded. "Lyle Wynn Shipless." Aginin jerked as though every word was a slap. "May I withdraw?" she asked stiffly, bending in sharp bow. "If you want to go, then go," Matt growled. Bringing her in the first place had not been the best notion he ever had, but maybe he could recover a little without her. Eyes locked on the floorboards, Aginin sank to her knees. "Please, may I withdraw?" Tuan sat there straight-backed on the floor, staring through the taller woman, clearly not seeing her at all. Selucia eyed Aginin up and down, pursing her lips. Satala pushed her needle through the cloth stretched on her hoop. No one so much as glanced at Matt. Aginin dropped to her face, and Matt bit back a startled oath when she kissed the floor. "Please," she said hoarsely, "I beg leave to withdraw." "You will go, Lyle Wynn," Selucia said, cold as a queen speaking to a chicken thief. "And you will not let me see your face again unless it is covered by a shea dancer's veil." Aginin scrambled backward on hands and knees and all but tumbled out the door, so fast that Matt was left gaping. With an effort, he managed to regain his smile. There seemed little point in staying, but a man could make a graceful exit. "Well, I suppose..." Tuan wriggled her fingers again, still not looking at him, and Selucia cut him short. "The High Lady is weary toy. You have her permission to go." "Look, my name is Matt," he said. "An easy name. A simple name. Matt." Tuan might as well have been a porcelain doll, in truth, for all the response she made. Satala set down her embroidery, though, and rose with one hand resting lightly on the hilt of the curved dagger stuck behind her belt. "Young man, if you think you're going to lounge about till you get to see us readying for bed, you're sadly mistaken." She smiled, saying it, but she did have her hand on her knife, and she was Ebudari enough to stick a man on a whim. Tuan remained an unmoving doll, a queen on her throne, somehow mistakenly dressed in ill-fitting clothes. Matt left. Aginin was leaning on one hand against the side of the wagon, her head hanging. Her other hand was gripping the necklace around her throat. Arnon moved, a little way off in the darkness, just to show he was still there. A wise man to keep clear of Aginin just then. Matt was too irritated for wisdom. "What was that about?" he demanded. "You don't have to go on your knees to Tuon anymore. And Salusha? She's a bloody lady's maid. I don't know anybody who'd jump for his queen the way you jumped for her." Aginin's hard face was shadowed, but her voice was haggard. "The High Lady is who she is. Salusha is her Sojin. No one of the low blood would dare meet her Sojin's eyes, and maybe not the high blood either." The clasp broke with a metallic snap as she jerked the necklace free. "But then, I'm not of any blood now." Rearing back, she put her whole body into throwing the necklace as far into the night as she could. Matt opened his mouth. He could have bought a dozen prime horses with what he paid for that thing and had coin left. He closed it again without saying a word. He might not always be wise, but he was wise enough to know when a woman really might try to stick a knife in him. He knew another thing as well. If Aginin behaved this way around Tuon and Salusha, then he had better make sure the Suldam were kept clear. The Light only knew what they would do if Tuon started wiggling her fingers. That left him with a job of work to do. Well, he hated work, but those old memories had his head stuffed full of battles. He hated battle, too. A man could get killed dead, but it was better than work. Strategy and tactics. Learn the ground, learn your enemy. And if you could not win one way, you found another. The next night, he returned to the Purple Wagon, alone. And once Oliver had finished his lesson in stones from Tuon, Matt inveigled his way into a game. At first, sitting on the floor across the board from the dark little woman, he was not sure whether to win or lose. Some women liked to win every time, but the man had to make her work for it. Some liked the man to win, or at least more often than he lost. Neither made any sense to him. He liked to win, and the easier the better. But that was how it was. While he was dithering, Tuon took matters out of his hands. Halfway through the game, he realized she had him in a trap he could not get out of. Her white stones were cutting off his black everywhere. It was a clean and resounding win for her. "You don't play very well, Toy," she said mockingly. Despite the tone, her big liquid eyes considered him coolly, weighing and measuring. A man could drown in eyes like that. He smiled and made his goodbyes before there could be any thought of kicking him out. Strategy. Think to the future. Do the unexpected. The next night, he brought a small red paper flower made by one of the show's seamstresses, and presented it to a startled Salusha. Satala's eyebrows rose, and even Tuon seemed taken aback. Tactics. Put your opponent off balance. Come to think, women in battles were not that different. Both wrapped a man in fog and could kill him without trying, if he was careless. Every night he visited the Purple Wagon for a game of stones under Satala and Salusha's watchful eyes, and he concentrated on the cross-hatched board. Tuon was very good, and it was all too easy to find himself watching the way she placed her stones, with her fingers bent back in a curiously graceful way. She was used to having fingernails an inch long, and taking care not to break them. Her eyes were a danger, too. You needed a clear head in stones or battle, and her gaze seemed to reach inside his skull. He buckled down to the game, though, and managed to win 4 of the next 7 with 1 draw. Tuon was satisfied when she won and determined when she lost, with none of the temper tantrums he had feared. No scathing comments aside from insisting on calling him Toy. Not very much of that icy regal hauteur, as long as they were playing anyway. She purely enjoyed the game, laughing exultantly when she pulled him into a trap, laughing in delight when he managed a clever placement to escape. She seemed a different woman once she lost herself in the stones board.
Cheers.
A flower sewn from blue linen followed the paper blossom, and 2 days later, a pink silk bloom that spread out as wide as a woman's palm. Both handed to Salusha. Her blue eyes increasingly set in a suspicious frown when they rested on him, but Tuon told her she could keep the flowers, and she stored them away carefully, folded in a linen cloth. He let 3 days pass without a present, then brought a little cluster of red silk rosebuds, complete with short stems and glistening leaves that looked as real as nature, only more perfect. He had asked the seamstress to make it on the day he bought that first paper flower. Salusha took a step, reaching to accept the rosebuds with a curl to her lip, but he sat down and put the flowers beside the board, a little toward Tuon. He said nothing, just left it lying there. She never so much as glanced at it. Dipping into the small leather bags that held the stones, he plucked one from each and shuffled them between his hands till even he was unsure which was where, then offered his closed fists. Tuan hesitated a moment, studying his face with no expression, then tapped his left hand. He opened it to display the glistening white stone. "I've changed my mind, Toy," she murmured, placing the white stone carefully on the intersection of two lines near the center of the board. "You play very well." Matt blinked. Could she know what he was up to? Salusha was standing at Tuan's back, seemingly absorbed in the almost empty board. Satala turned a page in her book and shifted a little to get a better light. Of course not. She was talking about stones. If she even suspected his real game, she would toss him out on his ear. Any woman would. It had to be the stones. That was the night they played to a draw, with each of them controlling half the board in irregular pools and patches. In truth, she won a victory. "I have kept my word, Toy," she drawled as he was replacing the stones in the bags. "No attempts to escape, no attempts at betrayal. This is confining." She gestured around at the interior of the wagon. "I wish to take walks. After dark will do. You may accompany me." Her eyes touched the cluster of rosebuds, then rose to his face. "To make sure I don't run away." Satala marked her place with a slim finger and looked at him. Salusha stood behind Tuan and looked at him. The woman had kept her word, bad as that seemed. Walks after dark, with most of the showfolk already in their beds, would do no harm. Not with him there to make sure. So why did he feel that he was losing control of the situation? Tuan agreed to go cloaked and hooded, which was something of a relief. The black hair was growing back in on her shaved scalp, but so far it was little more than long fuzz, and unlike Salusha, who very likely slept in her headscarf, Tuan had shown no inclination to cover her head. A child-sized woman, with hair shorter than any man not going bald, would have been remarked even in the night. Satala and Salusha always followed at a little distance in the darkness, the lady's maid to keep a protective eye on her mistress, and Satala to keep an eye on the maid. At least, he thought that was how it was. Sometimes it seemed they were both watching him. The two of them were awfully friendly for guard and prisoner. He had overheard Satala cautioning Salusha that he was a rogue with women, a fine thing for her to be saying, and Salusha had calmly replied that her lady would break his arms if he showed any disrespect, just as if they were not prisoners at all. He thought to use these walks to learn a little more about Tuan. She did not talk much over a stones board, but she had a way of ignoring what he asked, or deflecting the subject, usually to him. "The Two Rivers is all forests and farms," he said, as they strolled along the main street of the show. Clouds hid the moon, and the colorful wagons were indistinguishable dark shapes, the performers' platforms lining the street merely shadows. "Everybody grows tobacco and races sheep. My father breeds cows, too, and trades horses. But mostly it's tobacco and sheep from one end to the other." "Your father trades horses," Tuan murmured. "And what do you do, Toy?" He glanced over his shoulder at the two women ghosting along 10 paces back. Satala might not be close enough to hear if he kept his voice down, but he decided to be honest. Besides, the show was dead quiet in the darkness. She might hear, and she knew what he had been doing in Abu Dar. "I'm a gambler," he said. "My father called himself a gambler," Tuan said softly. "He died of a bad wager." "And how are you supposed to find out what that meant?" Another night, walking along a row of animal cages, each one built to fill an entire wagon, he said, "What do you do for fun, Tuan? Just because you enjoy it, aside from playing stones?" He could almost feel Salusha bristling at his use of her name from 30 feet away, but Tuan did not seem to mind. He thought she did not. "I train horses and the money," she said, peering into a cage that held a sleeping lion. The animal was only a large shadow, lying on the straw behind the thick bars. "Does he really have a black mane? There are no lions with black manes in all of Shenzhen." She trained Damani? For fun? Light. "Horses? What kind of horses?" It might be war horses if she trained bloody Damani. For fun. "Mistress Annan tells me you're a scoundrel, Toy." Her voice was cool, not cold. Composed. She turned toward him, face hidden in the shadows of her cowl. "How many women have you kissed?" The lion woke up and coughed, a deep sound guaranteed to raise the hair on anyone's head. Tuan did not even flinch. "Looks like rain's coming again," he said weakly. "Salush will have my hide if I get you back soaked." He heard her laugh softly. What had he said that was funny? There was a price to pay, of course. Maybe things were going his way and maybe not, but when you thought they were, there was always a price. "Bunch of chattering magpies," he complained to Aginan. The afternoon sat on the horizon, a red-gold ball half hidden by clouds, casting the show in long shadows. There was no rain for once, and in spite of the cold, they were sitting hunched beneath the green wagon they shared, laying stones in plain sight of anyone who walked by. A good many did, men hurrying about some last-minute chore, children snatching the final chance to roll hoops through the mud puddles and toss balls before night fell. Women holding their skirts up glanced at the wagon in passing, and even when they were hooded, Matt knew what their expressions were. Hardly a woman in the show would speak to Matt Cawthon. Irritably, he rattled the black stones he held gathered in his left hand. "They'll get their gold when we reach Lugard. That's all they ought to care about. They shouldn't be poking their noses into my business." "You can hardly blame them," Aginan drawled, studying the board. "You and I are supposed to be fleeing lovers, but you spend more time with her than with me." She still had trouble not calling Tuan High Lady. "You behave like a man courting." She reached to place her stone, then stopped with her hand above the board. "You can't think she'll complete the ceremony, can you? You can't be that big a fool." "What ceremony? What are you talking about?" "You named her your wife 3 times that night in Ebudar," she said slowly. "You really don't know? A woman says 3 times that a man is her husband, and he says 3 times she's his wife, and they're married. There are blessings involved, usually, but it's saying it in front of witnesses that makes it a marriage." "You really didn't know?" Matt laughed and shrugged his shoulders, feeling the knife hanging behind his neck. A good knife gave a man a feeling of comfort, but his laugh was hoarse. "But she didn't say anything." He had bloody well been stuffing a gag in her mouth at the time. "So whatever I said, it doesn't mean anything." But he knew what Aginan was going to say. Sure as water was wet, he knew. He had been told who he was going to marry. "With the blood, it's a little different. Sometimes a noble from one end of the empire marries a noble from the other. An arranged marriage. The imperial family never has any other kind. They may not want to wait until they can be together, so one acknowledges the marriage where she is, and the other where he is. As long as they both speak in front of witnesses, inside a year and a day, the marriage is legal." "You truly didn't know?" Sure was sure. But the stones still spilled from his hand onto the board, bouncing everywhere. The bloody girl knew. Maybe she thought this whole thing was an adventure or a game. Maybe she thought being kidnapped was as much fun as training horses or bloody Damani. But he knew he was a trout waiting for her to set the hook. He stayed away from the purple wagon for 2 days. There was no use running. He already had the bloody hook in his mouth, and he had put it there himself.
I'll be right
But
back.
he did not have to swallow the flaming thing. Only, he knew it was just a matter of when she decided to jerk the line tight. As slowly as the show moved, eventually they reached the ferry across the Eldar, running from Alkindar on the west bank to Koromin on the east. Tidy little walled towns of tile-roofed stone buildings with half a dozen stone docks each. The sun was climbing high, hardly a cloud crossed the sky, and those white as new-washed wool. No rain today, maybe. It was an important crossing, with trading ships from upriver tied to some of the docks and big barge-like ferries crawling from one town to the other on long sweeps. The Shonchan apparently thought so too. They had military camps outside both towns, and from the stone walls beginning to rise around the camps and the stone structures going up inside, they had no intention of leaving soon. Matt crossed over with the first wagons riding pips. The brown gelding looked ordinary enough to an undiscerning eye. It did not seem out of place for him to be ridden by a fellow in a rough woolen coat with a woolen cap pulled down over his ears against the cold. He was not actually considering making a run for the hilly wooded ridge country behind Corman. Thinking about it, but not really considering. She was going to set the hook whether he ran or not. So he sat Pips at the end of one of the stone ferry landings, watching the show cross over and trundle away through the town. There were Sean-Chan on the landings, a squad of beefy men in segmented armor, painted blue and burnt gold under a lean young officer with one thin blue plume on his odd-looking helmet. They seemed to be there just to keep order, but the officer checked Luca's horse warrant, and Luca inquired whether the noble lord might know of ground outside the town suitable for his show to perform. Matt could have wept. He could see soldiers wearing striped armor in the street behind him, wandering in and out of shops and taverns. A rocket swooped down out of the sky on long-ribbed wings, alighting outside one of the camps across the river. 3 or 4 of the snake-necked creatures were already on the ground. There had to be hundreds of soldiers in those camps, maybe 1,000. And Luca was going to put on his show. Then one of the ferries hit the rope-padded bumpers at the end of the landing, and the ramp came down to let the windowless purple wagon rumble off onto the stones. Satala was driving, so Lucia sat on one side of her, peering out from the hood of a faded red cloak. On the other side, swathed in a dark cloak, so not an inch of her showed, was Tuan. Matt thought his eyes were going to fall out of his head, if his heart did not pound its way out of his chest first. The dice had started up in his head, that rattling feel of dice rolling across a table. They were going to come up the Dark One's eyes this time. He just knew it. There was nothing to do except fall in beside the purple wagon, though, riding along as though life were wonderful, riding along the wide main street through criers for shops and hawkers selling things from trays. And Sean-Chen's soldiers. They were not marching in formation now, and they eyed the brightly painted wagons with interest, riding along and waiting for Tuan to shout. She had given her word, but a prisoner would say anything to get the shackles loosened. All she had to do was raise her voice and summon 1,000 Sean-Chan soldiers for rescue. The dice bounced and spun in Matt's head. Riding along, waiting for the Dark One's eyes. Tuan never spoke a word. She peeked curiously past the edge of her deep cowl. Curiously and cautiously, but she kept her face hidden, and even her hands, all wrapped in that dark cloak, and even huddling against Satala like a child seeking the protection of her mother in a strange crowd. Never a word until they had passed the gates of Corman and were rumbling toward the base of the ridge that rose behind the town, where Luca was already gathering the show's wagons. That was when Matt really knew there was no escape for him. She was going to set the hook all right. She was just biding her bloody time. He made sure all the Sean-Chan stayed in their wagons that night, and the Aes Sedai, too. Nobody had seen any Suldam or Damani that Matt knew, but the Aes Sedai did not argue for once. Tuan did not argue either. She made a demand that sent Satala's eyebrows almost to her hairline. It was phrased as a request, in a way a reminder of a promise he had made. But he knew a demand when a woman made one. Well, the man had to trust the woman he was going to marry. He told her he had to think on it, just so she would not start imagining she could have anything she wanted out of him. He thought on it all the day that Luca put on his show, thinking and sweating while as many Sean-Chan as not came to gape at the performers. He thought on it while the wagons wound eastward through the hills, moving slower than ever, but he knew what answer he had to give. On the 3rd day after leaving the river, they reached the salt town of Jurador, and he told Tuan that he would. She smiled at him, and the dice in his head stopped dead. He would always remember that. She smiled, and then the dice stopped. A man could weep. Chapter 29. Something flickers. This do be madness, Dillman rumbled from where he stood with his arms folded as if blocking the way out of the wagon. Maybe he was. His jaw was thrust forward belligerently, sticking out a beard that was trimmed short, but still longer than the hair on his head, and he was working his hands like a man thinking of making fists, or grappling with something. A wide man, Dillman, and not as fat as he looked on first glance.
That hurt.
Matt wanted to avoid fists or grappling, if he could. He finished tying the black silk scarf around his neck, hiding his scar, and tucked the long ends into his coat. The chance that there was anyone in Jurador who knew about a man in Abu Dar wearing a black scarf, well, the odds seemed good, even discounting his luck. Of course, there was always his being Taviran to be factored in, but if that was going to bring him face to face with Surah, or a fistful of servants from the Terracin Palace, He could stay in bed with a blanket wrapped around his head, and it still would happen. Sometimes you just had to trust to luck. The trouble was, when he woke this morning, the dice had again been tumbling in his head. They were bouncing off the inside of his skull still. "I promised," he said. It was good to be back in decent clothes. The coat was a fine green wool, well cut and hanging almost to his knees in the turned-down tops of his boots. There was no embroidery, maybe it could do with a little, but he had a touch of lace at his cuffs, and a good silk shirt. He wished he had a mirror. A man needed to look his best on a day like this. Picking up his cloak from the bed, he swung it across his shoulders. Not a gaudy thing like Luca's. Dark gray, nearly as dark as night. Only the lining was red. His cloak pin was simple silver knots, no larger than his thumbs. "She gave her word, Bale," the Guinan said. "Her word. She will not break that, ever." The Guinan sounded absolutely convinced. More convinced than Matt was, anyway. But sometimes a man had to take a chance, even if he was wagering his neck. He had promised. And he did have his luck. "It'd still be madness," Billman grumbled. But he moved grudgingly away from the door when Matt settled his broad-brimmed black hat on his head. Well, when Nagina motioned him aside with a quick jerk of her head, anyway. He kept his glower, though. She followed Matt out of the wagon, scowling herself and fiddling with her long black wig. Maybe she still felt uneasy with it. Or maybe it fit differently now that she had close to a month's growth of her own hair underneath. Not enough to go about bareheaded yet, in any case. Not till there was at least another 100 miles between them and Nebudar. Maybe it would not be safe until they crossed the Damona Mountains into Murity. The sky was clear, the sun just cresting the horizon, invisible yet behind the show's canvas wall. The morning was warm only compared to a snowstorm. Not the crispness of a late winter morning in the Two Rivers, but a chill that slowly bored deep and put a faint mist in your breath. The showfolk were scurrying about like ants in a kicked anthill, filling the air with shouted demands to know who had moved those juggling rings or borrowed that pair of red-spangled dresses, or shifted this performing platform. It looked and sounded like the start of a riot, yet there was no real anger in any of the voices. They shouted and waved arms all the time, but it never came as low as there was a show in the offing, and somehow every performer would be in place and ready before the first patrons were let in. They might be slow packing up for the road, but performing meant money, and they could move fast enough for that. "You really do think you can marry her?" Nagina muttered, striding along at his side, wore skirts. There was nothing dainty about Nagina. She had a long stride, and she kept up easily. Dress or no dress, she seemed to need a sword on her hip. "There's no other explanation for this. Bale is right. You are mad." Matt grinned. "The question is, does she mean to marry me? The strangest people marry sometimes." When you knew you were going to hang, the only thing to do was grin at the noose. So he grinned and left her standing there with a scowl on her hard face. He thought she was growling curses under her breath, though he did not understand why. She was not the one who had to marry the last person on earth she wanted to. A noble woman, all cool reserve and her nose in the air, when he liked barmaids with ready smiles and willing eyes. The heir to a throne, and not just any throne. The crystal throne, the imperial throne of Shonchan. A woman who spun his head like a top and left him wondering whether he held her captive or she held him. When fate gripped you by the throat, there was nothing to do but grin. He kept a jaunty pace till he was inside of the windowless purple wagon, and then he missed a step. A cluster of acrobats, 4 limber men who called themselves the Chavana brothers, though it was plain as their noses they came from different countries, not just different mothers, rushed out of a green wagon nearby, shouting and gesturing wildly at one another. They spared a glance for the purple wagon and another for Matt, but they were too engrossed in their argument and trotting too fast for more. Gorderon was leaning against one of the purple wheels, scratching his head and frowning at the 2 women who stood at the foot of the wagon's wooden steps. 2 women, both swathed in dark cloaks, faces concealed, yet there was no mistaking the flowered headscarf hanging out of the taller woman's cowl. Well, he should have known Tuan would want her maid along. Noble women never went anywhere without a maid. Bet a penny or bet a crown, in the end it all came down to a toss of the dice just the same. They had had their chance to betray him. Still, he was betting on a woman making the same choice twice running. On two women doing it. What fool would make odds on that? But he had to toss the dice. Except they were already rolling. He met Solucia's cold blue stare with a smile and swept off his hat to make an elegant like to on. Not too showy, just a small flourish of his cloak. Are you ready to go shopping? He very nearly called her Milady, but until she was willing to say his name. I have been ready for an hour, Toy, Tuan drawled coolly. Casually lifting an edge of his cloak, she glanced at the red silk lining and eyed his coat before letting the cloak fall. Lace suits you. Perhaps I will have lace added to your robes if I make you a cupbearer. His smile slipped for an instant. Could she still make him dock a veil if she married him? He would have to ask Regina. Light, why did women never make it easy? You want me to come along, my lord? Cordoran asked slowly, not quite looking at the women now. He tucked his thumbs behind his belt and did not quite look at Matt either. Just carry, maybe? Tuan did not say a word. She just stood there looking up at Matt, waiting, big eyes getting cooler by the second. The dice bounced and rattled in his head. Well, he only hesitated a heartbeat before jerking his head to send the red arm away. Maybe 2 heartbeats. He had to trust his luck, trust her word. Trust is the sound of death. He stepped on that thought hard. This was no song, and no old memory could guide him. The dice inside his skull kept spinning. With a slight bow, he offered his arm, which Tuan examined as if she had never seen an arm before, pursing those full lips. Then she gathered her cloak and set off with Solucia gliding at her heels, leaving him to hurry after them. No, women never did make it easy. Despite the early hour, 2 burly fellows with cudgels were already guarding the entrance, and a third, with a clear glass pitcher to take the coins and dump them through a slot in the iron-strapped box on the ground. Each of the 3 looked too clumsy to palm a copper without falling on his face. But Luca took no chances. 20 or 30 people were already waiting inside the heavy ropes that led to the big blue banner naming Luca's show, and unfortunately, Littell was there too, stern-faced in a dress sewn with crimson spangles and a cloak sewn with blue. Luca's wife trained bears. Matt thought the bears did their tricks for fear she might bite them. I have everything in hand, he told her. Believe me, there's nothing to worry about. He might as well have spared his breath. Littell ignored him, frowning worriedly at Tuan and Solucia. She and her husband were the only 2 showfolk who knew who they were. There had seemed no reason to tell either about this morning's jaunt. Luca, at least, would have had kittens. The stare Littell shifted to Matt was not worried, just stone hard. Remember, she said quietly, if you send us to the gallows, you send yourself. Then she sniffed and went back to studying the people waiting to get in. Littell was even better than Luca at judging the weight of a purse before the drawstrings were undone. She was also 10 times tougher than her husband. The dice tumbled on. Whatever had set them spinning, he had not yet reached the fateful point, the deciding point. She is a good wife for Master Luca, Tuan murmured when they had gone a little way. Matt looked at her sideways and resettled his hat on his head. There had been no mockery in her tone. Did she hate Luca that much? Or was she saying what sort of wife she would be? Or, burn him, he'd go as crazy as Dillman thought he was, trying to puzzle this woman out. She had to be the reason for the feel of the dice in his head. What was she going to do? It was a short walk away from the rising sun to the town, along a hard-packed road through hills that were treeless here, but people dotted the road the way windmills and salt pans dotted the hills. Staring straight ahead, they moved so purposefully, they seemed not to see anyone in front of them. Matt dodged a round-faced man and nearly walked right into him, which made him have to jump away from a white-haired old fellow, making a good speed on spindly legs. That put him in front of a plump girl who would have run up the front of him if he had not jumped again. Are you practicing a dance, Toy? Tuan said, peering up at him over a slim shoulder. Her breath made a faint white mist in front of her cowl. It isn't very graceful. He opened his mouth just to point out how crowded the road was. Suddenly he realized he could no longer see anyone beyond her and Solucia. The people who had been there were just gone, the road empty as far as he could see before it made a bend. Slowly he turned his head. There was no one between him and the show either, just the folk waiting in line, and that looked no longer than before. Beyond the show, the road wound into the hills toward a distant forest, empty. Not a soul in sight. He pressed fingers against his chest, feeling the fox-head medallion through his coat. Just a piece of silver on a rawhide cord. He wished it felt cold as ice. Tuan arched an eyebrow. Salusha's stare named him fool. "I can't buy you a dress standing here," he said. That was the point of this expedition, his promise to find Tuan something better than dresses that hung on her and made her look like a child in grown-up's clothing. At least he was pretty sure he had promised that, and she was perfectly certain. The needlework of the show's seamstresses met with Tuan's approval, but not the cloth they had available. Performers' costumes glittered with spangles and beads and bright colors, but the cloth was usually whatever could be found cheaply. Those who had better kept it and used it till it wore out. Jurador made its money from salt, though, and salt made a great deal of money. The town's shops should offer any sort of material a woman could wish. There was no finger-wiggling this time. Tuan shared a look with Salusha. The taller woman shook her head, a wry, rueful twist to her mouth. Tuan shook her head. And they gathered their cloaks and started toward the town's iron-studded gates. Women. He hurried to catch up again. They were his prisoners, after all. They were. Their shadows stretched out long in front of them. Had any of those people cast shadows before they vanished? He could not recall any of them breathing a mist either. It hardly seemed to matter. They were gone. And he was not going to think about where they had come from or where they had gone. Probably something to do with being Taviran. He was going to put it out of his head. He was. The dice rattling away left room for nothing else. The gate guards seemed incurious about strangers, or at least about a man and two women afoot. Hard-faced fellows in white-painted breastplates and conical helmets with what looked like horse tails for crests. They ran impassive eyes over the cloaked women, lingering suspiciously a moment on Matt for some reason, and then returned to leaning on their halberds and staring blankly at the road. They were local men, most likely, in any case, not Shonchan. The salt merchants and the local lady, Ethelin, who apparently said whatever the salt merchants told her to, had sworn the oaths of return without hesitation, and offered to pay a salt tax before they were asked. No doubt the Shonchan would get around to installing some sort of official here eventually, just to keep an eye on everything, but for the moment, they had more important uses for their soldiers. Matt had sent Tom and Julian both to make sure there were no Shonchan in Jurador before agreeing to this excursion. A fool could trip over his own luck if he was not careful. It was a prosperous, busy town, Jurador, with stone-paved streets, most of them wide and all lined with stone buildings roofed in reddish tiles. Houses and inns rubbed shoulders with stables and taverns, in a noisy jumble with a blacksmith's clanging hammer on an anvil here, and the racketing of a rug weaver's looms there, and everywhere, it seemed, coopers hammering bands on tight barrels for transporting salt. Hawkers cried pins and ribbons, meat pies and roasted nuts from trays, or winter-wrinkled turnips and sorry plums from barrows. On every street, men and women stood guard over the display goods on narrow tables in front of their shops, and bellowed lists of what was offered within. Picking out the salt merchants' houses was easy, though. 3 stories of stone rather than 2, covering 8 times as much ground as any others, each with a columned walk overlooking the street and shielded by white wrought-iron screens between the columns. The lower windows on most houses had those screens, though not always painted. That much was reminiscent of Abu Dar, but little else was, beyond the olive complexions of the people. There were no deep necklines exposing cleavage here, no skirts sewn up to display colored petticoats. The women wore embroidered dresses with high necks right up to their chins. A little embroidery for the common folk, a great deal for the richer, who wore cloaks embroidered top to bottom and sheer veils hanging over their faces from combs of goldwork or carved ivory stuck into dark coiled braids. The men's short coats were worked almost as thickly in colors just as bright, and rich or poor, most men wore a long belt knife with a blade a little less curved than those in Abu Dar. Rich or poor, the fellows did have a tendency to fondle their knife hilts as if expecting a fight, so maybe that was the same. The Lady Ethelin's palace appeared no different from the outside than the salt merchants' mansions, but it was located in the town's main square, a wide expanse of polished stone, where a broad, round marble fountain sprayed water into the air. People filled their buckets in big pottery water jars from pipes spilling into stone basins at the corners of other squares, though. The big fountain put out a smell of brine. It was a symbol of Jurador's wealth, pumped from the same source as the salt wells in the surrounding hills. Matt got to see a good deal of the town before the sun climbed even halfway to its noon peak. Every time Tuan and Solucia spotted a shop with silks displayed out front, they stopped at the long, narrow table to feel bolts of cloth and whisper with their heads together, waving off the attentions of the watchful shopkeeper. Those kept a very watchful eye until they realized Matt was with the two women. In their stout woolens, well worn and badly fitting, they did not look like customers for silk. Matt,
Give me a sec,
with
and
one
I'll
side of
hold
his
it
cloak
down.
thrown back to
Just
expose
a
the
sec
lining, he did. Whenever he tried to show an interest, though, women said they wanted you to show an interest. Whenever he got close enough to hear what they were saying, the women fell silent and looked at him, cool dark eyes and cool blue staring out of their deep cowls, until he fell back a step or two. Then Solucia would bend her head to Tuan's, and they would go back to murmuring and fingering silk, red silk, blue silk, green silk, smooth shimmering silk, and brocaded silk. Jordan was a very wealthy town. Luckily, he had tucked a fat purse of gold into his coat pocket. None of it seemed to be right, though. Inevitably, Tuan shook her head, and the pair of them glided away into the crowd, with Matt hurrying to keep up as far as the next shop, showing silks. The dice continued to bounce off the inside of his skull. They were not the only ones from the show who had come into the town. He spotted Eludra, her face framed by beaded braids, walking through the crowd with a gray-haired man who had to be a salt merchant from the amount of bright embroidery covering his silk coat in flowers and hummingbirds. What would the illuminator want with a salt merchant? Whatever she was saying to him, his pleased smile had added a few creases to his face, and he was nodding. Tuan shook her head, and the two women glided toward the next shop, ignoring the shopkeeper's deep bows. Well, most of those were directed at Matt. Maybe the skinny fool thought he wanted to buy silk for himself. Not that he would have passed up a new silk coat or three, but who could think about coats when he was waiting for those bloody dice to stop? Just a little embroidery on the sleeves and shoulders. Tom went by, clutching his bronze-colored cloak around him, knuckling his long white mustaches and yawning as if he had spent the night awake. He might have. The Gleeman had not taken to drink again, but Lopen and Nairn complained about him remaining awake till all hours, burning a lamp so he could read and reread his precious letter. What could be so fascinating in a letter from a dead woman? A dead woman. Like, maybe there's people on the road. No, he was not going to think about that at all. Tuan plucked one fold of silk and let it drop as she turned away without trying another. Solucia gave the stout shopkeeper such a stare before following that the woman started back in front. Matt offered her a smile. Affronted shopkeepers could lead to town guards asking questions, and who could say what that might mean? He knew he could smile most women into feeling soothed. The round-faced woman sniffed at him and bent to smoothing the bolt of silk as tenderly as tucking in a veil. Most women, he thought sourly. Down the street, a woman in a plain cloak let her hood fall back, and Matt's breath caught in his throat. Edicina lifted her cowl again, but she took no hurry with it, and the damage was done anyway, an eyes-at-eyes, ageless face displayed for anyone who knew what they were seeing. No one in the street gave a sign that they had noticed anything, but he could not see every face. Was anyone thinking of a reward? There might be no Shonchan in Joridor at the moment, but they did pass through. Edicina glided around a corner, and two dark-cloaked shapes followed her. Two. Had the Sultan left only one of their number in the camp to watch two eye to eye? Or maybe Jolene or Teslin was somewhere close by, and he had missed seeing her. He craned his neck, searching the throng for another plain cloak, but everyone he saw had at least a little embroidery. Abruptly, it hit him like a stone between the eyes. Every cloak he could see had at least a little embroidery. Where were bloody Tuan and bloody Solucia? Were the dice spinning faster? Breathing hard, he went up on his toes, but the street was a river of embroidered cloaks, embroidered coats and dresses. It did not mean they were trying to escape. Tuan had given her word. She had passed up a perfect chance for betrayal. But all either woman had to do was say 3 words, and anyone who heard them likely would recognize a Shonchan accent. That might be sufficient to set the hounds on his trail. There were 2 shops ahead that seemed to be offering cloth, one on either side of the street. Neither were the pair of dark-cloaked women at the tables out front. They could have turned a corner easily enough, but he had to trust to luck. His luck was especially good when the game was random. Bloody women probably thought it was a bloody game. Burn him, let his luck run good. Closing his eyes, he spun in a circle in the middle of the street and took a step. At random. He bumped into someone solid, hard enough to make them both grunt. A bulky fellow with a small mouth and a little poorly done scrollwork on the shoulders of his rough coat stood glaring at him when he opened his eyes, glaring and fingering the hilt of his curved knife. Matt did not care. He was facing straight at one of the two shops. Pulling his hat down tight, he ran. The dice were rolling faster. Divided shelves stuffed with bolts of cloth lined the walls of the shop from floor to ceiling. More stood stacked on long tables out on the floor. The shopkeeper was a scrawny woman with a large mole on her chin, her assistant slim and pretty and angry-eyed. He dashed inside just in time to hear the shopkeeper say, "For the last time, if you won't tell me what you're here for, I'm going to send Nelsa for the guards." Tuan and Solutia, faces still hidden in their hoods, were walking slowly along one wall full of cloth, stopping to touch a bolt, but neither paying the shopkeeper any heed. "They're with me," Matt said breathlessly. Tugging the purse from his pocket, he tossed it on the nearest clear table. The heavy clink it made landing put a wide smile on the shopkeeper's narrow face. "Give them whatever they want," he told her. And to Tuan, he added firmly, "If you're going to buy anything, it's going to be here. I've had all the exercise I care for this morning." He would have had the words back as soon as they left his mouth if he could. Speak to a woman that way, and she flared in your face like one of Eludra's fire sticks every time. But Tuan's big eyes looked up at him from the shelter of her hood, and her full mouth curved slightly in a smile. It was a secret smile, for herself, not him. The light only knew what it meant. He hated it when women did that. At least the dice had not stopped. That had to be a good sign, right? Tuan had no need of words to make her choices, silently pointing out bolt after bolt and measuring with her small dark hands how much the shopkeeper was to cut off with her shears. The woman did the work herself, instead of delegating it to her assistant, and well she might, considering. Red silk in several shades went under those long sharp scissors, and green silk in a few shades, and more varieties of blue silk than Matt knew existed. Tuan chose out some fine linen in several thicknesses, and lengths of bright wool. She consulted Solutia over those in muffled whispers, but mostly it was silk. He got back much less of his purse than he had expected. Once all that cloth had been folded and neatly tied, then bundled into a larger length of coarse linen, at no extra charge, thank you very much, it made a mound as fat as a peddler's pack. It did not surprise him at all to learn that he was expected to carry the thing across his shoulders with his hat dangling in one hand. Dress your best, buy a woman's silk, and she still found a way to make you work. Maybe she was making him pay for speaking firmly. He earned plenty of stares from gaping fools as he made his way out of the town behind the two women. They glided along smug as cats full of cream. Even cloaked and hooded, their backs said it all. The sun was still well short of midday, with a line of people waiting to get into the show stretched down the road almost to the town. Most gaped and pointed as if he were a painted fool. One of the big horse handlers guarding the coin box gave a gap-toothed smirk and opened his mouth, but Matt returned him a level look, and the fellow decided to put his eyes back on the coins going from townsfolk to glass pitcher to box. Matt thought he had never been so relieved to be inside Luca's show. Before he and the two women had gotten 3 steps inside the entrance, Julian came running up, for a wonder without Thera or his face. The thief-catcher's face could have been carved from ancient oak. Eyeing the people flowing past them into the show, he pitched his voice low. "I was coming to find you. It's a Guinan. She's been hurt. Come quickly." The man's tone said enough, but worse, Matt realized the dice in his head were drumming now. He flung the pack of cloth at the horse handlers with a hasty injunction to guard it as close as the coin box where he would set the women on them, but he did not wait to see whether they took him seriously. Julian darted back the way he had come at and Matt ran after him. Along the wide main street of the show, where noisy, gawking crowds were watching the 4 bare-chested Giovanna brothers stand on one another's shoulders, and contortionists in filmy trousers and glittering vests sit on their own heads, and a slack rope walker in spangled blue breeches climbing a long wooden ladder to begin her performance. Short of the slack rope walker, Julian dodged into one of the narrower streets, where laundry hung from the lines between the tents and wagons. Formers sat on stools and wagon steps waiting to go on, and show children ran playing with balls and hoops. Matt knew where they were headed now, but the thief-catcher ran too fast to overtake. Ahead he saw his green wagon. Littell was peering underneath, and Luca, in one of his bright red cloaks, was waving a pair of jugglers to move along. The two women, in baggy trousers and with faces painted white, like a noble's fools, took a good look under the wagon before they obeyed. As they came closer, he could see what they had been staring at. Coatless, Dolman was sitting on the ground under the edge of the wagon, cradling a limp Nagina in his arms. Her eyes were closed, and a trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Her wig hung askew. That stood out for some reason. She always fussed so to keep that wig straight. The dice beat like thunder.
This could be disaster.
Luca growled, splitting his glower between Matt and Julian. It was an angry glower, though, not frightened.
You may have brought me to disaster.
He shooed away a gaggle of wide-eyed children and growled at a plump woman in skirts that glittered with silvery spangles. Leora made leopards do tricks that even Matella would not try, but she merely tossed her head before gliding off. No one took Luca as seriously as he took himself. The man gave a start when Tuon and Selucia hurried up, and looked on the point of telling them to go too, before he thought better of it. In fact, he began to frown thoughtfully and worriedly. It seemed his wife had not told him about Matt and the women leaving the show, and it was clear they had been somewhere. The blue-eyed woman had the huge bundle of cloth on her back now, with her arms doubled behind her, though she stood straight despite the bulk. You would think a lady's maid was used to carrying things, but her face was a picture of frustrated irritation. Bertel eyed her up and down, then sneered at Matt as if he were the reason the woman was thrusting her considerable bosom out. Luca's wife was very good at sneering, and Tuon's stern expression made Bertel nearly look mild. A judge peered out of her cowl, a judge ready to pass sentence. For the moment, Matt did not care what the women thought. Those bloody dice! Tossing his cloak back, he went to one knee and touched fingers to Aginan's throat. Her pulse beat weakly, thin and fluttering. What happened? He asked. Have you sent for one of the sisters? Moving Aginan might be enough to kill her, but there might be time for healing if the Aes Sedai were quick. He was not about to say that name aloud, though, people walking by, pausing for curious stares before Luca or Littell hurried them on. Everyone moved quicker for her than for him. Littell herself was the only one who really jumped for Luca. Rena! Dillman spat the name. Despite his short cap of hair, that hilly on her beard that left his upper lip bare, he did not look ridiculous now. He looked afraid and murderous, a dangerous combination. I did see her stab Aginan in the back and run. If I could have reached her, I would have broken her neck, but my hand be all that's holding Aginan's blood in. Where be that bloody Aes Sedai? He snarled. So much for being careful with his tongue. I be right here, Pale Doman, Teslin announced coldly, rushing up with Thera, who took one horrified look at Tuon and Selucia, latched onto Julian's arm with a squeak, eyes on the ground. The way she began trembling, she might be there herself in a minute. The hard-eyed Aes Sedai made her face as if she had a mouthful of briars when she saw what lay in front of her, or maybe where it lay. But she swiftly crashed underneath the wagon beside Doman and clasped Aginan's head in her bony hands. Jolene to be better at this than I, she muttered, half under her breath. But I may be able. The silver fox head went cold against Matt's chest, and Aginan jerked so violently that her wig fell off, nearly pulling herself out of Doman's grasp as her eyes popped open wide. The convulsion lasted only long enough for her to sit halfway up with a frozen gasp. Then she slumped back against Doman's chest, panting, and the medallion became just a piece of worked silver again. He was almost accustomed to that. He hated being accustomed to that. Teslin slumped too, on the point of falling over until Doman shifted his grip on Aginan to steady the Aes Sedai with one hand. Thank you, Teslin said after a moment, the words sounding dragged from her. But I need no help. She used the side of the wagon to help her rise, though, the cold Aes Sedai gaze daring anyone to comment. The blade did slide on her rib, and so did miss her heart. All she does need now be rest and food. She had not delayed to grab a cloak, Matt realized. In one direction, along the narrow street, a bunch of women in spangled cloaks was watching from in front of a green-striped tent, their gazes intent and focused. In the other, half a dozen men and women in white-striped coats and tight breeches, acrobats who performed on horseback, darted looks toward Teslin between putting their heads together to whisper. Too late to worry about someone recognizing an Aes Sedai's face. Too late to worry that one of them knew healing when he saw it done. The dice battered at the inside of Matt's head. They had not stopped. The game was not played out yet. Who's looking for her, Julian? He asked. Julian.
I'm not there.
The thief
Carry
catcher
back
gave
to my.
was glaring at Tuon and Selucia, murmuring to Thera, though he
Might be
continued to
make
catch
it
the
worse.
Bannon and the Red Arms, Open and Naren. Oliver, too. He was away before I could catch him. But in this, He stopped, soothing Thera long enough to gesture toward the main street. The babble of voices was clearly audible, even at this distance. All she needs is to lay hands on one of those fancy cloaks and she can slip out with the first folk to leave. If we try stopping every woman with her hood up, or even try looking inside, we'll have a riot on our hands. These people are touchy.
Disaster.
Luca moaned, wrapping his cloak around himself tightly. Littell put an arm around him. It must have been like being comforted by a leopard, but in any case, Luca did not look much comforted. Burn me, why? Matt growled. Brenna was always ready to lick my bloody wrist. I thought if anybody went over the edge.
Back out of me.
He did not even glance at Thera, but Julian still scowled at him darkly. Dominit stood up with Aginin in his arms. She struggled feebly at first. Aginin was not a woman to let herself be carried about like a doll. But eventually she seemed to realize that if she did make her own feet, she would fall over. She sagged against the Ileanor's chest with a resentful glower. No one would learn, even when a woman needed help. If she did not want it, she made you pay for giving it. I'm the only one who knew her secret, she drawled in a weak voice. The only one who might give it away, at least. She may have thought it would be safe to go home, with me dead. What secret? Matt asked. The woman hesitated for some reason, frowning at Doman's chest. Finally, she sighed. Brenna was leashed once.
Right.
So were
Sure,
Bethlehem and
smoke a
Sita.
shot.
They can channel. Or maybe learn to. I don't know. But the Idam worked on those three. Maybe it works on any Sul'dam. Matt whistled through his teeth. Now that would be a kick in the head for the Sean-Chan. Luca and his wife exchanged puzzled glances, plainly not understanding a word. Teslin's mouth hung open, Aes Sedai serenity washed away in shock. Solution made an angry sound, though, blue eyes blazing, and dropped the bundle of cloth from her back as she took a step toward Dolan. A quick flash of Tuon's fingers stopped her in her tracks, though it was a quivering halt. Tuon's face was a dark mask, unreadable. She did not like what she had heard, though. Come to think, she had said she trained Damani. Oh, burn him. On top of everything else, he was going to marry a woman who could channel. The sound of horses' hooves announced Harnan and the other three Red Arms, coming along the narrow way between the tents and wagons at a quick trot. Their swords were belted on under their cloaks, that one with a dagger almost as long as a short sword to boot. Corderon had his heavy crossbow hanging at his saddle, already drawn and latched. The crank at his belt would take a full minute to pull back the thick cord, but this way, all he need do was place a bolt. Harnan carried a double-curved horsebow, the bristling quiver at his hip. Bergen was leading Pips. Harnan did not bother dismounting, eyeing Tuon and Selucia suspiciously, and Luca and Littell with almost as much doubt. He leaned down from his saddle, the crude hawk tattoo sharp on his cheek. Brenna stole the horse, my lord, he said quietly. Rode down one of the horse handlers at the entrance getting out. Bannon's following her. He says she could reach Coromand sometime tonight. That's the way she's headed. She's moving a lot faster than the wagons did. But she's riding bareback. We can catch her with luck. He sounded as if that luck were a matter of fact. The men of the band trusted Matt Coffin's luck more than he did himself. There did not seem to be any choices, really. The dice were still pounding in his head. There was still a chance they might fall his way. A small chance. Matt Coffin's luck. Get your people on the road as fast as they can pack up, Luca, he said, stepping up onto Pips. Leave the wall and anything else you can't get onto the wagons fast. Just go.
Are you crazy?
Luca spluttered.
If I try to chase those people out, I will have a riot. And they'll want their coin back.
Like the man would think of money with his neck stretched on the headsman's block. Think what you'll have if 1,000 Sean-Chan find you here tomorrow. Matt's voice was as cold as he could make it. If he failed, the Sean-Chan would run Luca's show down in short order, however fast they flogged their horses. Luca knew it too, from the twist of his mouth, as if he had just bitten a rotting plum. Matt made himself ignore the man. The dice were drumming hard, but they had not stopped yet. Julian, leave all the gold for Luca except one good purse. Maybe the man could bribe his way clear, once the Sean-Chan saw he did not have their daughter of the 9 bloody moons. Gather everybody and ride out as soon as you can. Once you're out of sight of the town, take to the forest. I'll find you. Everybody? Sheltering Thera with his body, Julian jerked his head toward Tuon and Selucia. Leave those two in Jurador. The Sean-Chan might stop with getting them back. It might slow them down, at least. You keep saying you're going to turn them loose sooner or later. Matt met Tuon's eyes. Big, dark, liquid eyes. A smooth expression on his face. She had pushed her hood back a little so he could see her face clearly. If he left her behind, then she could not say the words, or if she did, he would be too far away for the words to matter. If he left her behind, he would never learn why she smiled those mysterious smiles, or what lay behind the mystery. Right, he was a fool. Pips danced a few impatient steps. "Everybody," he said. Did Tuon nod slightly as if to herself? Why would she nod? "Let's ride," he told Harnan. They had to walk their horses through the crowds to get out of the show, but as soon as they reached the road, Matt put Pips to a gallop, Cloak screaming behind and head down to keep his hat from blowing off. It was not a pace he could keep a horse at for long. The road wound around hills and crossed ridges, occasionally cutting through where the rise was not too high. They splashed across ankle-deep streams and thundered over low wooden bridges crossing deeper water. Trees began to appear on the slopes again, pine and leatherleaf, showing green among the winter-bare branches of the others. Farms clung to some of the hills, low tile-roofed stone houses and taller barns, and now and then a hamlet of 8 or 10 houses. A few miles from the show, Matt spotted a wide man ahead of them, sitting his saddle like a sack of suet. The horse was a leggy dun, eating ground at a steady trot. He had figured that a horse thief had an eye for a good animal. Catching the sound of their hooves, Bannon looked back, but he only slowed to a walk. That was bad. When Matt slowed Pips beside the dun, Bannon spat. "Best wager we got is we find her horse run to death so I can track her afoot from there," he muttered. "She's pushing harder than I figured with her bareback. If we push, we can maybe catch her by sunset. If her horse don't founder or die, that's about the time she'll make Corlin." Matt tipped back his head to glance at the sun, almost straight overhead. It was a long way to cover in less than half a day. If he turned back, it could be a good distance the other side of Jurador by sunset, in company with Tom and Julian and the others. With Tuon. With the Seanchan knowing to hunt Matt Coffin. The man who had kidnapped the daughter of the Nine Moons could not own enough luck to get off with being made Duck of Vale. And sometime tomorrow or the next day, they would plant Luca on an impaling stake. Luca and Littell, Petra and Clarine and the rest. A thicket of impaling stakes. The dice rattled and bounced in his head. "We can make it," he said. There was no other choice. Bannon spat. There was only one way to cover a great deal of ground quickly on a horse, if he meant to be on a live horse at the end. They walked the animals for half a mile, then trotted half a mile. The same at a canter, then a run, and it was back to a walk. The sun began to slide downward, and the dice spun. Around sparsely forested hills and over treetop ridges, streams that could be crossed in 3 strides, barely wetting the horse's hooves, and streams 30 paces across with flat ridges of wood or sometimes stone. The sun sank lower and lower, and the dice spun faster and faster. Almost back to the Eldar, and no sign of Rena except scuffs on the hard dirt of the road that Bannon pointed to as if they were painted signs. "Getting close now," the fat man muttered. He did not sound happy, though. Then they rounded a hill, and there was another low bridge ahead. Beyond, the road twisted north to cross the next ridge through a saddle. The sun, sitting atop the ridge, blazed in their eyes. Corman lay on the other side of that ridge. Pulling his hat lower for shade, Matt searched the road for a woman, for anyone, mounted or afoot, and his heart sank. Bannon cursed and pointed. A lathered bay was laboring its way up the slope on the other side of the river, a woman frantically kicking its flanks, urging it to climb. Rena had been too anxious to reach the Seanchan to stick with the road. She was maybe 200 paces from them, and she might as well have been miles. Her mount was on the point of collapsing, but she could get down and run within the sight of the garrisons before they could reach her. All she had to do was reach the crest, another 50 feet. "My lord," Arnon said. He had an arrow nocked, and his bow half raised. Gorderon held the heavy crossbow to his shoulder, a thick pointed bolt in place. Matt felt something flicker and die inside him. He did not know what. Something. The dice rolled like thunder. "Shoot," he said. He wanted to close his eyes. The crossbow snapped. The bolt made a black streak through the air. Rena slammed forward when it hit her back. She had almost managed to push herself erect against the bay's neck when Harnon's arrow took her. Slowly, she toppled from the horse, sliding down the slope, rolling, bouncing off saplings, tumbling faster and faster until she splashed into the stream. For a moment, she floated face down against the bank, and then the current caught her and pulled her away, skirts billowing up on the water. Slowly she drifted toward the Eldar. Maybe, eventually, she would reach the sea. And that made 3. It hardly seemed to matter that the dice had stopped. That made 3. Never again, he thought, as Renner floated out of sight around the bend. If I die for it, never again. They did not press, riding back eastward. There was no point, and that felt too bone-weary. They did not stop, though, except to breathe and water the horses. No one wanted to talk. It was the small hours of the night when they reached Jurador, the town a dark mass with the gates shut tight. Clouds covered the moon. Surprisingly, the canvas walls of Luca's show were still in place just beyond the town, with a pair of bulky men wrapped in blankets, snoring unaware beneath the big banner as they guarded the entrance. Even from the road, in the dark, it was plain that wagons and tents filled the space behind the wall. At least I can tell Luca he doesn't have to run after all, Matt said wearily, turning Pitts toward the banner. Maybe he'll give us a place to sleep a few hours. For all the gold he had left, Luca should give him his own wagon, but knowing the man, Matt had hopes for clean straw somewhere. Tomorrow he would set out to find Tom and the others, and Tuon. Tomorrow, when he had rested. A greater shock waited inside Luca's huge wagon. It truly was roomy inside, at least for a wagon, with a narrow table sitting in the middle, and space to walk around it. Table, cupboards, and shelves all were polished until they glowed. Tuon was sitting in a gilded chair. Luca would have a chair, and gilded. Everybody else made do with stools, with Selucia standing at her back. A beaming Luca was watching Mattel offer Tuon a plate of steaming pastries, which the dark little woman was examining as if she would actually eat something that Luca's wife had cooked. Tuon didn't surprise at all at Matt walking into the wagon. "Is she captured or dead?" she said, picking up a pastry with her fingers curved in that curiously graceful way. "Dead," he said flatly. "Luca, what in the light?" "I forbid it, Toy," Tuon snapped, pointing a finger at him sharply. "I forbid you to mourn a traitor." Her voice softened slightly, but it remained firm. "She earned death by betraying the Empire, and she would have betrayed you as easily. She was trying to betray you. What you did was justice, and I name it so." Her tone said that if she named a thing, then it was well and truly named. Matt squeezed his eyes shut for a moment. "Is everyone else still here too?" he demanded. "Of course," Luca said, still smiling like a bull-goose fool. "The lady, the High Lady, forgive me, High Lady," he bowed deeply. "She talked to Marilyn and Sandar, and, well, you see how it was. A very persuasive woman, the lady, the High Lady. Often about my gold. You said they were to hand it over, but Marilyn said he'd slit my throat first, and Sandar threatened to crack my head, and—" He trailed off under Matt's stare, then suddenly brightened again. "Look what the lady gave me." Snatching open one of the cupboards, he pulled out a folded paper that he held reverently in both hands. It was thick paper and white as snow. Expensive. "A warrant. Not sealed, of course, but signed. Valen Luca's grand traveling show and magnificent display of marvels and wonders is now under the personal protection of the High Lady Tuon Athaim Cora Payandrag. Everyone will know who that is, of course. I could go to Shanjan. I could put on my show for the Empress. May she live forever," he added hastily, with another bow to Tuon. For nothing, Matt thought bleakly. He sank down on one of the beds with his elbows on his knees, earning a very pointed look from Mattel. Likely only Tuon's presence kept her from clouding him. Tuon raised a peremptory hand, a black porcelain doll, but every inch a queen despite the shabby too-large dress. "You are not to use that, except at need, Master Luca. Great need." "Of course, High Lady, of course." Luca bobbed bows as if he might be kissing the floorboards any minute. All for bloody nothing. "I did make specific mention of who is not under my protection, Toy." Tuon took a bite of pastry and delicately brushed a crumb from her lip with a finger. "Can you guess whose name heads that list?" She smiled. Not a malicious smile. Another of those smiles for herself. Amusement or delight in something he could not see. Suddenly he noticed something. That little cluster of silk rosebuds he had given her was pinned to her shoulder. Despite himself, Matt began to laugh. He threw his hat down on the floor and laughed. With everything, all his efforts, he did not know this woman at all. Not a bit. He laughed until his ribs hurt.
Chapter 30.
All right, everyone. I'm gonna call into this life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keeps stopping by. I appreciate all y'all support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe.